Morning, everyone, and welcome back. So today is February 2nd, the feast of the presentation of the Lord of 2019. And this is the course on the beginning of the bioethical issues on the beginning of human life in the Master in Bioethics at St. Thomas University. Just on the recording for the record. So we begin, as always, with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Blessed Trinity, we love you, we adore you, and we thank you for all your many blessings, for the gift of life, faith, and for being here together once again, for this teaching as we explore your truth in our lives, and particularly the whole issue of ensoulment today, which makes us human persons in your image and likeness. We thank you for the gift of your Son on this feast of the presentation. We thank you for entering our humanity and showing us the way, the truth, and the life. We pray in a special way for those who are in most need of your divine mercy today throughout the whole world. We also keep in mind John Ziegler, the father of Father Ziegler, Eric Ziegler, a friend of ours who is now teaching in Colorado, and the funeral of his father is today, this afternoon. We ask comfort and solace for his family and for all those who have lost dear ones. In the name of Christ, our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. All right, so let me turn off the lights, adjust the sight. For the past couple of weeks, we have been covering reproduction, and especially sexual reproduction, and in mammals, the whole process of fertilization and embryonic development, to show basically a continuum from fertilization to birth, a continuum of very rapid, very drastic development from one cell to trillions of cells, specialized, and then in less than 1 year, right, within 9 months of the normal pregnancy, and then that development doesn't end at birth, rather it continues for the lifetime, even though we grow much less in size for the rest of our lifetime. We still continue to grow and develop and so forth. So bottom line, there is really a continuum of development from fertilization to death. And so no particular point of that development is substantially different. And substantially is a philosophical term that I'll get into more today, because it will be a segue into what we call ensoulment. When does a human receive a human soul, right? To finish the package, as it were. All right, and so if we go backwards in development, we see that that first stage of development is going to be the fertilized egg, which by definition is no longer an egg, because now fertilized egg is diploid, right? And by definition, eggs are gametes, which are haploid. So truly, the proper term is zygote. And the zygote, morning, Andrea, hand out there. All right, hand out there. So really the zygote would be or is the first stage of embryonic development, and so it stands to reason that is the first moment of the new individual. For the human and for the non-human, we see that that is consistent, that is kind of universal in the sense that all animals, and even plants that reproduce sexually, they begin as a zygote, okay? So let me stop for a moment and ask if there are any questions or comments or retractions. No? All right, but it's been mostly on the science so far, on nature. Today we're going to make a little bit of a shift and go a little bit into the theology of bioethics, right? By way of philosophy. So philosophy is the tool of theology. We need philosophy in order to do theology. And philosophy allows us to reason. Basically, we use reasoning for engaging in theology. But once we get to theology, we have an advantage in that we have inspiration, divine inspiration, right? In other words, God complements and supplements what we're missing by way of reason. We can only reason so far, and then we need illumination from the Lord to figure out the rest. For example, keep in mind the most intriguing pregnancy in all of humanity, Mary's pregnancy, right? Which was a virgin pregnancy, and both Mary and Joseph knew that, and yet the pregnancy was real, physical, physiological. Had there been a sonogram back then, there would have been a heartbeat and everything else, okay, on embryonic Jesus. And therefore, the reason can only go so far. In fact, in Sacred Scripture, it says there that Joseph, being a just man, a just Jew, a righteous Jew, was planning on divorcing Mary quietly, separating from her quietly. They were already engaged, but they had not lived together yet, right? And then he has a dream, and the angel gives him the illumination. Do not be afraid, Joseph, of taking Mary into your home, because she has conceived by the Holy Spirit, okay? And so that is the extra. Joseph's reasoning can only go so far. Excuse me, and it was a proper reasoning, right? Being a just man, a righteous man, he reasoned properly according to the Jewish tradition and according to the Jewish faith. But he hit like an invisible wall in his reasoning that he couldn't figure out, all right? So the logical conclusion was that Mary was pregnant by someone else at the human level. And so he wasn't passing judgment, but he was walking away from that until he got the message. And that was the divine illumination, all right? So that's a concrete example where you can see that we can only go so far with a reasoning. We can go very far, but then we also depend on God's grace and God's illumination, which comes to us through the two pillars of our faith, Scripture and tradition with a capital T. Meaning that the Holy Spirit continues to act and live today in the church, in the magisterium, in the people of God. And so we continue to have illumination today. And sacred Scripture, again, can go a long way, but mostly at the level of big basic principles. The details have been left out to the magisterium over the centuries and over the millennia, because the issues come up, progressively and periodically. I'm sure that transgenderism was not a big issue at the time of Jesus, because simply the technology wasn't available to do it. And even transplants, organ transplants, is a fairly recent issue, right? And yet the Holy Spirit is talking about organ transplants and is talking about transgenderism to illumine us on how to go about it the proper way and live God's will, okay? All right, so let me switch here for a moment to do a little background in philosophy and theology, mostly philosophy, on matter and form. Again, no, the light is there, sorry, good. Thought I had forgotten to record. Is it pausing? Yeah, it's pausing, all right. It's a little green, this little thing. They could make it smaller, to let us know that it's recording. All right, you remember Meyer. So Meyer, I have great admiration for Meyer, aside the fact that he lived 100 years. He was one of the greatest biologists that we had last century, in the 20th century, and he pretty much spanned the whole century. So he himself saw a lot of growth and development in biology and the natural sciences, and was very active part of that. One of his stellar contributions was precisely the definition of species, biologically speaking, right? Which has those cool characteristics of being able to metabolize and produce fertile offsprings. So what I find ironic is that in the definition of species, it's a parallel to the essence, and yet he rejects essentialism, if you recall, from one of his early chapters where he attempts to do some philosophy there and even blames religion for slowing down the progress of science, mostly because of a fundamentalistic interpretation of scripture. And it's coming out of a Protestant camp. Now, him being German, I presume that his influence was more Protestant on the religious side. And I really don't know his, have not studied his early background in detail, but I suspect he did not have a good philosophy teacher. Especially he could have benefited from a scholastic philosophy, which was more in the Catholic tradition, beginning with, well, the big systematizer for Catholic theology was Thomas Aquinas, which was in the Middle Ages in the 12th, 1300s. But he could have certainly benefited a lot from scholastic philosophy, because he would have given him the rigor, the philosophical rigor to consider that what he was proposing biologically as a species is philosophically the essence. And grammatically, it is the substance or the substantive, what we call the noun, all right? El sustantivo. Think about it. When we say desk, all right? Desk. Now, how many different types of desk are there? There's an infinite different type of desk, as far as the material that it's made of, the shape, the size, etc., etc., etc. But we can all intuit, and at some point in our early growth, we realize that this is a desk, and it's not an elephant, and it's not a cloud. All right? So these are nouns. That is the substantive of the sentence, which gives us the what is it, the substance. It gives us the object. All right? And that is an essence, that is a substance, all right? And that is what we call the form of the thing. Now, to the point that once we understand desk or table, we go to a foreign country where we have never been before, and we see a table and we say table. And we don't say astronaut or bacteria, okay? Because we recognize it as that noun, grammatically speaking, and it allows us to communicate with other people in many different languages because they will all have a noun, a category of noun, all right? Then there is the adjective, grammatically speaking. The adjective is one that qualifies the noun, and will put color, shape, and measure, and so forth. You know, the huge desk or the orange desk. That is the adjective that is qualifying the noun, but it is the noun that is the substance, okay? And so, bottom line, philosophically, we can say that everything, what we call a thing, all right, everything has matter and form, matter and form. And the matter is pretty much the material of which things are made up of, all right? Is the material. But the form is the essence, is the substance, is the noun, okay? So when we say human being or human person, distinct from giraffe being and distinct from hippopotamus being, right? We're qualifying that being, that matter, as in the form of the human and not a different form. Now here, there's something unfortunate about the word form, because when scientists, when empirical scientists, particularly biologists, talk about form, they really mean shape, okay? We mean shape. When we say form in the natural sciences, particularly biology, and for example, anatomy, we mean the shape. There's even a field called morphology, all right, that studies the shape or the structure, the anatomy of living beings. But they're not studying the substance, the essence. So morphology should really be named properly, should be shapeology, okay? Because it's studying the anatomy, the structural aspect of living beings. But form is a deeper concept. And it is truly the essence or the substance, truly what Meyer was calling the species. Okay? All right, so that as a background, we can say that every matter has its proper form and every form has its proper matter, vice versa. You see, there is an amalgam, there is a substantial unity, for lack of another word, between the matter and the form of things. Okay, so that our human form also includes a human matter, which is our body, organically speaking, our human body, as opposed to the body of a non-human, which is also alive and organic and everything else, but it's non-human. Okay, so I think I belabored that enough, because we're going to use that to enter into the whole question of ensoulment. When does ensoulment happen? And the two options are either immediate or delayed ensoulment, or immediate or mediate, right? So immediate ensoulment or delayed ensoulment are the possibilities. Okay. So I need to go where? Here we go. So really what we're going to look at now is the ontological status of the human embryo. Okay, ontological, again, ontos is a reference to being, right? Individual being. In other words, when do we begin individually? In contrast to last semester's course was that when do we begin as a species? So the phylogenesis of the human species, right? And we did that whole analysis. Now we're looking at it at the individual level, because how we answer this question, when we begin as a human being, will have a drastic difference on a number of bioethical issues at the beginning of human life today in the United States and in many countries of the world. Think of abortion and even contraception, in vitro fertilization, stem cell research. These are at least 4 very hot topics that are on today. And not a week goes by, right? Not a week goes by without having another bioethical issue rise again, like New York State last week, which actually was on the 22nd of January, precisely on the date when we mark again the nefarious decision of the Supreme Court in 1973 of the legalization of abortion. Okay, so they took it to the ultimate possible limit, of course, preparing for the possibility of reversing Roe versus Wade, and therefore it will revert back to the states. We'll get into all that in the second part of the lecture when we look at abortion. But now I need to finally establish when do we receive a soul which would make us really truly human, okay? So this is the issue of the ontological status. And you can see it's philosophical, but it's also theological, because we're going to be talking about God and God's gift of an individual soul. All right, so let's get right to it. This issue of ensoulment. First, these 3 concepts, again, trying to open them up, open up the package of human life. All right, so I'm positing that it is at the zygote level, right? Where we have a single cell. And we can say, well, a zygote, and it's a human zygote, in other words, is a fertilized human egg by human sperm. Now we have a zygote, doesn't look like a human, in the sense that it doesn't look anything like any one of us, because it's not at our stage. It depends on the stage that we're talking about. So a human zygote is just a fertilized egg, and it looks like a cell, like a little ball, microscopic, 10 microns across, and transparent to the naked eye and microscopic and so forth. But it looks nothing like what we're used to looking at human beings. But there you can see we're focusing on the shape, right? Which is a very superficial thing. Because even at the level of detail, none of us look alike anyway at the level of shape. But however, the zygote looks exactly, the human zygote looks exactly how it's supposed to look like at that level, at that stage. So even the shape of a human zygote is consistent with what it should look like at that stage. You know, and then the morula, the blastocyst, and the gastrula, at each one of those stages, those human beings, right, are looking exactly how they're supposed to look like at that stage. All right, so we agree that the zygote is, if it's alive, it's living, metabolizing, and within 24 hours, it's going to undergo mitosis and split into two and continue that geometric growth as we know, et cetera, et cetera. So we can say that it is, and it's an individual, there's integrity, and the integrity is maintained, by the way. Remember, the integrity is maintained during the travel, during the passage from the ampulla to the endometrium. Bless you. The integrity of that little embryo, early embryo growing, is held together by the complex, by the cumulus clouds, the cumulus layers of the early embryo, right? Remember, the egg is not by itself stripped by itself, bless you. It has the zona pellucida, the layer, mostly gelatin layer, and then the corona radiata also. So these are all cells that came off the follicle and are protecting the egg. So there's an integrity maintained there. And even we can say at the bare minimum is the cellular membrane of the egg, the zygote, the morula, the blastocyst, etc. Is that cellular membrane that is maintaining the integrity of that individual. Okay, so there is an individual. And it's alive. So it's an individual that is alive, is metabolizing, otherwise it's dead and then discarded through spontaneous abortion. And it is human because it's got the 23 pairs, it's diploid, it has the 23 pairs of the human genome, the 20,000 or 15,000 genes that make up the human, right? So it has the human genome and therefore it's human. Now, a human being, the word being is a philosophical term for thing. When we translate being to common language, is a thing, all right? So everything is a thing. When we talk about a dog, my pet dog is a dog being, but I just don't refer to the dog as a dog being, right? And I could refer to the parrot as a parrot being, but we don't do that. But to the human, we refer it as a human being, just affirming that we exist materially. But the being is by way of existence. Now, person. This is the exciting one, because here the etymology of the word helps us. In my opinion, it helps us a lot. I think it's a TH. In Spanish, it's etimología without the H, but I need to cheat. No H, okay. But a Y. Right, the etymology of words, especially of nouns, is very exciting because etymology is the origin and the meaning of the word, right? The origin and the meaning of the word, especially for nouns. It turns out that person, it's an interesting concept. Right here, and here, get this out of the way. Yeah. Where does person come from? Comes from the Greek, prosopon. Look at this. This is something I actually discovered when I was doing my first dissertation in Rome in the 90s. I thought it was a neat discovery because it turns out that the word person comes from prosopon in Greek, all right? In Greek. And prosopon is the mask. Greek theater, classical Greek theater, which, by the way, you know, we have an enduring debt with classical Greece in the 2nd and 3rd century before Christ for being the philosophical and the cultural foundation of our civilization, what we call Western civilization, all right? It is truly the philosophical and the cultural foundation of our Western civilization, even if the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, where Iran and Iraq are today, between the two rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, right? The Middle East that we saw last semester's course, that is the agricultural origin of civilization, the agricultural origin, when we estimate that modern man settled down, being from the hunter-gatherer to agriculture, which allowed us humans to settle down and to begin actually a culture, a material culture of producing stuff, right? Because while we were behind the herds and hunting around, we didn't have time to develop really a culture, and it was all oral tradition, there were no written languages, etc. But culturally, right, and philosophically, we go to classical Greece. As for example, in this theater, this is an amphitheater, and the actor, so this is a stage here, and this circle is kind of an extension of a stage. And the actor would be here. Typically, it would be one actor, okay? One actor who was always a man and had big lungs and could project his voice. I've heard that even they would train, they would go to the Aegean Sea, which is the local sea of the Mediterranean for Greece, the Greek islands, very beautiful Aegean Sea. Right? For example, something like that. Not bad, huh? Would you like to be there today? Look at the transparency of that. That's the shade, the shadow of the boat on the ocean floor through the transparent Mediterranean, which takes on this bluish color. Just beautiful, gorgeous. At any rate, they would go to the shoreline. So, yeah, here's the Aegean Sea. It's full of little islands all over, okay? So it's a huge archipelago. And part of it, the Peloponnesus. Anyway, these actors, they would practice by going to the shore of the sea, and many of these shores are actually pebble, all right? And because it's very rocky. And they would put these pebbles in their mouth, and they would practice their lines with pebbles in their mouth projected out to the sea. So to give them strength in the muscles of the mouth to be able to project, right? But then they would go back to the theater, and there were no microphones back then. But people up here, they could hear, otherwise they wouldn't make the seating way up here, okay? They could hear everything. Everyone was nice and quiet, but they could hear because this is so well designed engineerily and physically that the sound wave actually amplifies naturally through this kind of amphitheater, this shallow rise of the floor, okay? And today, a number of churches, the post-Vatican II churches, when churches were allowed to be amphitheater style instead of cruciform, they have used this design in a number of churches. I was at St. Kevin, it was one. Immaculate Conception is another one. It's huge, very slight slope like that. And it projects very well the sound. Anyway, the single actor would typically be standing or sitting here, and he would have a table in front of it. And on the table would be all these masks. And the different masks represented different gods or goddesses or heroes, right? And it was all about Greek mythology. The Greek mythology, which we know is polytheistic, is very rich. And the gods and goddesses are very passionate, in a big contrast with the rigor of Greek philosophy, which is very rational and not passional. But the gods and goddesses in their theology, in their mythology, were extremely passionate. It's kind of a contrast complementary contrast between their philosophy and their theology. At any rate, this is some examples of the masks, and you know the theater started there as a representation, but it was kind of their equivalent to the mass almost, in the sense that this was their religious way of connecting with the gods and the goddesses and reenacting their rich mythology, okay? So originally it was really a tragedy was the first. You know, there are three genres of theater, globally speaking. There's tragedy, there's comedy, and then finally there's drama, which is much more human-like, in the sense that sometimes we have good days and we have bad days, and overall it's a drama. Life is a drama, right? We don't know, expect the unexpected every time we wake up. But originally it was tragedy. And it was tragedy also because they had a fatalistic view. In other words, they were at the mercy of the gods, and they were like puppets. Humans were like puppets of the gods and goddesses, right? And the gods and goddesses would just be having fun with us. And so the fate of the human was tragic in the sense that we were in the hands of the gods and goddesses, and they would do whatever they want with us, including some gods falling in love with women, human women, and having sex with them. And the result was the heroes, like, for example, Hercules, right? And so they were human in shape, but they had superhuman abilities because they had some aspect of a god in them. And Ulysses and all these heroes, these are the heroes of old, all right? Which I made reference to way back. Anyway, so these are the masks, and the tragedy was first, but then the Bacchanalias started, and the Bacchanalias was with Bacchus, the god Bacchus, because they had also a god for wine, okay? And that was a fatal mistake, because in Bacchanalia, I think it's with a double C, oops. Let's see. Go here, just. With an H, yeah. So the bacchanals were the orgies of old. All right. And this was during the time of harvest of the grapes. Okay. And of course, they would press the grape and they would make the wine, and then they would drink the wine, and they would all get happy and wouldn't care less about the gods or goddesses and being used by the gods and goddesses. And they were just having a nice drunken party, and they were all very, very happy about it. And those were the Bacchanalia. Okay, so, and there was a god, Bacchus, who was in charge of the grapes and the vintage and all that. So through that was introduced into Greek theater, the comedy, right? The comedy, which to an extreme becomes satirical. Mm-hmm. And then finally, they come to that position of, in real life, there are good moments and bad moments and so forth. So finally, they come to drama, all right? But my point was that, so the actor would have all these masks in front of him. They represented different gods and goddesses and heroes, and people would know that. So he would pick up the face of Neptune and would speak out, all right? And everybody knew that was Neptune speaking. So the mask represented the person. What was not important was, the character was important, not the actor, okay? So the mask simultaneously reveals and conceals. The mask simultaneously reveals and conceals. It reveals the protagonist. It reveals the character, whichever god or goddess or hero they were talking about. Okay. So that's what it reveals. But it conceals the actor. Okay, it conceals the actor, who is a mere human and no goddess or god or hero, but a human like you and I. So that person had to be concealed. And that was what the mask did, has a double function. Okay? Kind of on which side of the mask are we looking? We're looking at the mask from the outside, or we're looking at the mask from the inside? Mm-hmm. So that's prosopon, and that's the person. In a sense, the face, our countenance, right, is our mask because it reveals and conceals. It reveals much of what we're thinking and feeling and so forth, but it also conceals our deepest thoughts and sentiments. Because with the face, we can represent joy or happiness or fear or many surprise and etc. You know, we can express many things with the mask. I think with the face, I think we have the largest number of different muscles and voluntary muscles in the face. Is it? Yeah, it's amazing how much control we have over the countenance expression. But really, at the very deepest of depths, only two people know really what I'm thinking right now, and that is God and myself. Very deeply at the level of conscience, all right, only God and myself know what I'm really thinking and feeling and so forth. All right, so the mask, the prosopon, is the person. Interesting. So can we say that the human embryo is a person? Can we say that the human zygote is a person? This goes a little bit beyond, but I think the argument has merit because the reason why abortion is legal today, up until the 9th month of pregnancy, up until the face actually comes out of the mother's body, physically, physiologically, the mass, the prosopon is not out yet. And so the law does not grant that thing, that being, humanity, of personhood, but it's a legal personhood, you see? So they have tied, the law has tied personhood to the mask, to the legal personhood of the face. But that face has to be out in the public or has to be out on air, you know, in the atmosphere. Cannot be, because obviously 1 minute before birth, that fetus has a face, right? And it's essentially the same face as that fetus is gonna have 1 minute after birth, but it's not outside, it's concealed. And it's still part of the mother's body. And therefore, that human fetus, that unborn, is not a legal person and can be killed. And that's exactly what New York State just did. Okay, legalize that to the ultimate extreme. And to boot, doesn't even have to be done by an MD, can be done by a nurse practitioner or even a PA. Okay, so they really pushed it to its maximum expression, just in case Roe v. Wade gets reversed. Okay, which means that it would go back to each state would have to decide yay or nay on the abortion and what number of restrictions to put on it. Okay, so you see, from knowing this of the origin of person, philosophically and etymologically and so forth, we can argue that the zygote is a human person. It's the best person because it reveals and conceals. In other words, it looks just by the physical shape of the fertilized egg, but is concealed. In other words, inside, internally, has the genome, has a human genome, specifically at the zygote, right? At the nucleus. The diploid nucleus is revealing that the zygote is human because it doesn't have the genome of another species. It has the human species. So from that perspective, if we take the etymological meaning of person, we can posit personhood on the zygote across the board because we're focusing on the form and not the shape. It reveals and conceals simultaneously who he or she is. Okay. Anyway, many of the arguments in society have gone away from positing personhood to the unborn because it gets complicated and one needs this kind of background or some kind of background to understand what person means. And it's not the person that we're used to looking at on a daily basis. Okay. All right, so then for ensoulment then, ensoulment meaning when does God posit or grant us a soul? Well, we have to see, we understand that logically there are two options. Either immediately, in other words, at fertilization at the level of the zygote, or delayed sometime after fertilization, right? Sometime after fertilization. These arguments have been going on back and forth. By the way, the church formally has never declared exactly, at least doctrinally, all right, ex cathedra, if you will, has never declared exactly when, I'm talking about the Catholic Church, when God posits the soul on the human, if it's immediate or it's delayed, to the point that there are some religious traditions, Catholic religious traditions, that still hold for delayed ensoulment, or at least they bracketed it on the side. The one who came closest to it was St. John Paul II in his encyclical on the Gospel of Life in 1995, when he leaves it at the level of a question. How can we not say that, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, how can we not say that that God does not grant a soul immediately at fertilization or at conception, all right? Because everything is pointing in that direction. Biologically and philosophically, everything points to the moment of fertilization. Then later, because we know that he was very pro-life, he was asked why he did not just make the statement, excuse me, as we call ex cathedra, from the chair, as a doctrinal statement. For example, the Immaculate Conception of Mary, that Mary was conceived without original sin, conceived without original sin, which even the doctrine of Immaculate Conception points to, you know, God granting a soul to Mary at conception, because if she did not have a soul at conception, then she couldn't sin either, right, at conception. And so that declaration of the Immaculate Conception, that she was conceived without original sin, is already saying indirectly that she had a soul at conception, right? But it's an indirect argument. Anyway, he was questioned, why didn't he just make a doctrinal statement? Because he had the power and authority to do that, as he called ex cathedra, you know, from the chair. And he said, because I don't want this to be the humanity or God, you know, the ensoulment of humans. I don't want it to be an ex cathedra statement. I don't want it to be coming from what we call the extraordinary magisterium. I want it to come from the ordinary magisterium. In other words, what is ordinarily defined in life. Okay, so it's a difference between what we call the extraordinary magisterium or the ordinary magisterium. It's a very, we're splitting theological hairs here, and I understand that you don't have the background on this, but extraordinary magisterium is these ex cathedra statements made from the chair, because they really don't have a logical explanation or reason stops. In other words, reason stops, like the virgin conception of Jesus in Mary's womb, like her assumption, for example, body and soul doesn't have a logical explanation, has a limit. And he was reasoning that he did not want to make it such that reason could not come up to it. He wanted to leave it to the ordinary magisterium, meaning that with enough reason and an exploration and being truthful to the science, to the scientific evidence, we can come to that conclusion by our reasoning, that God would deposit a soul on a human being at fertilization. So I'm going to give you those reasons, okay? And the arguments is kind of an argument to the contrary. If he did not posit a soul, if ensoulment was not immediate ensoulment, meaning that if God did not give a soul to each one of us at our conception, that could be possibly the most cruel thing that God could do, is to leave us soulless for any length of time, literally without a soul, but already human, biologically speaking, because we have the matter and the form. So we are fully human at the zygote, okay, philosophically speaking. In other words, we have the matter and the form, but we would be, if it was not immediate, we would be soulless for any particular length of time, even if it's just a few minutes, a few hours, or a few days, or a few weeks. And what if we were to die before we receive that later soul? Redemption would be, we would not be capable of being redeemed. We would be outside of redemption because there's no soul to redeem, you know. So it would automatically lock us out of the possibility of eternal life, of heaven, which is our ultimate destiny, which is a contradiction for God, because if we are God's image and likeness, then we belong to heaven. We belong to him, all right? And to leave us soulless, certainly our body is not, you know, a soulless body is not going to go into heaven. So it's an internal contradiction. If he did not give us a soul at conception, he would leave us soulless, literally soulless for any amount of time. And that is a very cruel thing to do. To leave a human being without a soul is a very cruel thing, because we cannot acquire a soul of our own. We can acquire a body through our parents, but our parents cannot give us a soul. And therefore, we have to conclude, since God cannot be cruel, right? There are many things that God cannot be. He cannot be vengeful, he cannot be cruel, he cannot be, you know, all the negative things. Then we have to assume that he grants the soul at conception. At the first possibility, when we have the matter to be informed, that's why I brought up matter and form. We have the matter substantially necessary to be informed by a soul, to form us. Okay, let me just finish the discourse. Let's take it 1 second before that egg is actually fertilized. That egg is just an egg, it's haploid, doesn't have the matter necessary for being informed. An egg cannot receive a soul, because an egg biologically is an extension of a woman who already has a soul. It's just a piece, it's a tissue, it's like skin cells, you know, it's a part of the person who already has a soul. And the same argument for the sperm. The sperm cannot receive a soul because the sperm is haploid, does not have the capacity to become a full human being on its own. But the zygote does, and it's the first stage, the zygote does, okay? So here we have a concurrence between the biology, between the philosophy and the theology, that it all concurs at the moment of the zygote. Okay. Let me stop there. Dr. Claudia, you had a question or a comment?
It was just, to me, before all this discussions and learning process, to be a human meant that you have a soul, and that's what made it different from, you know, the rest of other species.
Yes.
That was my own, you know, not scientifically.
Right, just your own intuition.
My intuition.
Exactly. The issue is that we need to continue to explore that, you know, we kind of have to push the limits here, because the arguments are coming from a secular society that is very utilitarian and doesn't have really the philosophical background to make the arguments. But there is an intuition that the zygote at any stage of development is human, it's a human being, right? Okay, but you see, we can say, and I had this discussion not a month ago. I don't know if you know, I had never seen it before. There's a program in Spanish on Telemundo that is called Camilo. It's like at night, at 9 o'clock at night was the interview. Anyway, we're talking about early embryonic development there, and I was invited to a program. But the other one who was invited also was the chief medical doctor for the in vitro clinic of Baptist System. Okay?
Was that a female doctor?
No, this one is a man. He's from Argentina. And so he's very fluent in Spanish, and the whole interview was in Spanish, the program. But, and so we got into it for sure on the humanity of the embryo and all this. And he said, but doctor, you had to study embryology and you had to study genetics to become a doctor, right? So it's just in the science of it. We have a human genome. Oh, yes. So we're talking about the blastocyst specifically, which is what they implant and so forth. So it has a human genome and it has its own integrity and it's alive. Oh, yes, it's alive. Otherwise, we wouldn't implant it if it weren't alive and so forth. So what is it? It says, well, it's just tissue. It's human tissue. It's tissue, like tissue from my skin or my liver somewhere.
That's why they get paid so much, because it's just tissue.
It's just tissue. Exactly. It's just tissue, And frankly, for him, unless it is implanted and actually growing in the mother, then that becomes a human being. So implantation basically is what gives humanity for him, implantation. But then for the pro-choice people and the abortion people, well, even implantation is not sufficient because they're going out there and really extracting someone who is already implanted. And so even that argument is not sufficient. And so it's challenging when a person of such status and study, and rigor says it's just tissue. Anyway, so these are some characteristics of the soul, of the human soul. It has to be individual and personal, right? So we each have our own soul. And it is also simple in the sense that it's not complex. In other words, it is indivisible. So there is not like our body, which is made up of parts. Our body is very complex, extremely complex, and we can even lose body parts and still be human, right? To the extreme, we could lose our 4 extremities, and as long as we have a head and a trunk, we have all the vital organs necessary to be alive and to be human and to be fully human, even if we are a quad amputee. So we're definitely not simple at the level of the body. The matter is complex, but our soul is simple in the sense that it is indivisible, okay? And it is also eternal, or maybe semi-eternal, in the sense that we did have an origin when God created our soul. And he created the soul at the time that our parents created the matter. At the fertilization. So we have an origin, and in that sense, we're not eternal, we're not co-eternal with God, in the sense that God did not have an origin, but we do have no end. Now, no end meaning a material finish, okay, a time when we are no longer, because again, the word end is not univocal, has different meanings, but we're not talking about the end as in existing no more. Rather, our end, if you will, is eternal life, and to exist forever, whatever that means, because it stretches the imagination. What does it mean to live forever? Because this side of the veil, this side of eternal life, we have no other experience like it. We really don't. So we can just intuit and allow the benefit of revelation to help us there too, with sacred scripture and the tradition of the church and so forth. But we will never experience eternity on this earth, right? So we really don't know. It's speculative. Again, we have the benefit of our tradition to help us there. Okay, so these characteristics being true for human soul, they have to hold in every case, in every human fertilization. That is human, okay? I say that is human because at some point there could be so much gross chromosomal abnormality, genetic abnormality, that what actually form and fertilize is not truly a human being. Of course, we know compatible with or consistent with the biological process, if there's such abnormality, typically that conceptus, that thing, is not going to make it to term. It's incompatible with life and will be discarded, typically early on. Those are the spontaneous abortions, or if it happens later, it will be a miscarriage. But the miscarriage, typically they're formed enough at least to have a soul, they just died early, all right? But at the very early stage, I'm talking of the moles that we talked about earlier, the hydatidiform moles, for example, that don't really have the matter necessary to be informed. So we can assume logically that they did not receive a soul, and therefore they're not a hydatidiform mole is not a human being. Okay. All right. So there has to be also. we have to resist a dualistic mentality which can creep in. Dualistic meaning to make a radical separation between matter and form, or between the soul and the body, all right? So it is not as if this is the bottle, the plastic bottle is my body, and the soul is the water that I poured into this body, okay? So it's not that God pours the soul into our body as I pour water into this bottle. That would be a dualistic view of humanity, separated and making a radical separation between body and soul. Rather, there is a substantial unity between body and soul, so that we have this whole, this integrity that we call the human person, the human being, the human individual. And John Paul II insisted a lot on that. He talked about the substantial unity of body and soul in the human, all right? Yes.
What about when somebody is in a coma and they don't survive? Does their soul go out of their body while they're there?
Okay.
I've heard of people having out-of-body experiences.
Right. Okay, so let's take it one step at a time. Let's start with a person in coma. Essentially, it's like a sleep, like a deep sleep, or we can push it even further into PVS, which is persistent vegetative state. We'll cover that in the second half of the course, actually, at the end of human life, all right, in more detail. But basically, a person is asleep for a prolonged period of time. We don't lose our soul when we were asleep last night, for example. It's not that my soul went out and came back, okay, and took a journey. Even though I had some weird dreams last night, my soul was still within me, okay? So the soul is still there as long as the person is still alive. Now, you said that at some point the soul left. Well, the soul left, then the person died, okay? And these near-death experiences that we hear about are, I'm going to say they are analogical in the sense that we hold, and it is Catholic teaching, that when a person is dead, the soul leaves, all right? And there's a temporary separation, which is another mystery. There's a temporary separation between body and soul by way of death. It was not God's original plan. It was introduced because of the original sin issue. But we can say that illness and death mysteriously were introduced by sin, but it was not God's original plan. So one of the original gifts of Adam and Eve was eternity, was immortality in their bodily. So they had a body that was an immortal body, all right? And they lost that. And we lost it through them. But my point is that when there is death and definite death, we no longer have a person in coma. Now we have a cadaver. We have only the material remains of that human being. And the soul is in God's mercy somewhere, hopefully in heaven, or maybe purgatory, or maybe hell, okay? But the soul is there no longer, so the person is dead. Truly, strictly speaking, that soul is not coming back. So all the near-death experiences that we have heard, with or without the lightning bolt hitting them, and with or without the white tunnel and so forth, and the person at the end of the tunnel greeting us with open arms, we hear all these. Those, we can say that psychologically, those are projections. Those are projections of what we would want to see, or what we would desire, what we think is going to happen. But technically, that's so. Realistically, existentially, that's so. If that person lived to recount that, that person did not die and come back to life, because there's no coming back from the dead. Okay? Strictly speaking, there's no coming back from the dead. So these near-life experiences, we have to put them in context of psychological projections that are projecting what the person would desire or would think it's going to happen. And that there's a match on them, that's interesting, that there's a match on many of these experiences unrelated to each other. Well, I attributed that similar to the match of primitive humans, the cave men and women who were painting and doing rituals and magic and burying the dead in different parts of the world, but they were doing essentially the same thing. In other words, a connection with the unknown, with God, and projecting that there is some other reality other than this reality here on earth, right? Okay, now, we can see then that the most logical moment for ensoulment is at fertilization, given all of this background, because it's the first stage where we have the matter proper to be informed with the human soul, meaning the human zygote, who is alive, who has the genome of human, who is diploid, and when left alone in his or her proper environment, will grow to 9 months to birth, and from birth to death, whenever the Lord calls us. And that's the earliest possible moment we can posit that soul. All right. Here's another word, teleology. Teleology is about the telos. Remember, telophase is the last phase of the mitosis, is the end, is the goal, the finish line. So our teleology is our ultimate end, is what Thomas Aquinas used to call the beatific vision. In other words, be in the presence of God for all eternity, right? In the presence of the Trinity. And we know that we wouldn't be there alone. We'd be with all the community of angels and saints. And that is our ultimate end, our teleology. It's another term used in theology. Now, if I have convinced you of all this, and that ensoulment happens at fertilization with the zygote, and the zygote is the first stage of the new individual for the rest of our lives, it turns out that we have two challenges to this. We have monozygotic twins, and even more of a challenge is a twin reabsorption, right? Which are biological processes that do happen. And so they cannot contradict our theology of immediate ensoulment. So how do we handle these two challenges? What am I talking about? All right, first of all, twinning. So monozygotic twinning, and the more weird one is twin reabsorption. With regards to immediate ensoulment, because one of the characteristics of the soul, of the human soul, is that it's indivisible, okay? So how do we get, in monozygotic twin, how do we get 2 from 1? Okay, it represents a challenge. First, a little background on twinning, because we have dizygotic twinning, and we have monozygotic twinning, and conjoined. But really, it's 2 types. It's either dizygotic or monozygotic, right? So here's dizygotic twinning, also known as fraternal twinning. Is that large enough? Too large. I can go to the other mode. Make it a little larger. Okay. So dizygotic, the prefix di is a reference to 2. Okay. Zygotic, zygote. We're familiar with that one. So dizygotic meaning 2 zygotes. How do we get 2 zygotes? 2 fertilizations. How do we get 2 fertilizations? Certainly 2 sperm. Well, there are millions of sperm hanging around, so there's no problem with 2 sperm. 2 eggs. In other words, this woman in her cycle, in that cycle, she ovulated 2 eggs, all right? She just ovulated mature 2 follicles. And I'm not sure if they have to be in opposite ampullae or they can be on the same ampulla. I don't know.
I think it can happen at the same.
Yeah, it can come from 1 ovary or the 2 ovaries, right? Either way. Okay, but the bottom line point here is that there are 2 eggs that are mature, waiting, ready, and they both got fertilized. So we have 2 zygotes from the start. Those 2 zygotes will develop through the morula, through the blastocyst, and through the gastrula and implant and all that, okay? And then whether they have, and so they will have 2 placentas because you actually have 2 trophoblasts. So you have 2 placentas and 2 of everything, 2 human beings, 2 individuals, therefore 2 ensoulments, right? Dizygotic twins are no problem. The monozygotic twins are the challenge because from 1 zygote, that zygote can split at different stages actually, even all the way into the gastrula. The gastrula can split in 2. So the window as far as I know, for the human, it's about 2 weeks for splitting. So it's not just at the zygote level or the morula level. You think that the first or second mitosis and so forth. No, the blastocyst can split. It's actually the ICM that splits, okay? Or even further, the early gastrula can also split. And depending on when the split happens, whether they will share a placenta or have independent placenta. Okay, if the earlier it happens, the more chances that they will each have their own placenta. But if the split happens later, and that's how we can tell that the split has happened after the establishment of the trophoblast and implantation, because they share a common placenta. Okay, so and the window, as far as I know, is up to 2 weeks, which is a week after implantation. All right, Giselle?
I'm just wondering, why is it a challenge in the sense of ensoulment if God's time is not linear like ours is?
Yeah, that's one approach to it, but that gets a little mystical as far as I'm concerned. I don't want to see it as a cop-out, because if this is a zygote, right, that may or may not split, and we really don't know the mechanism of splitting at the biochemical level. It's still an unknown, because the challenge is experimenting with human embryos, which we really don't want to do, even though some people I'm sure would want to do it. Anyway, so we have a zygote that is fertilized. And it moves all the way to the, but even here you see the ICM is intact, it's still an individual. Maybe here, maybe we have 2 individuals, okay? So when does God infuse the soul? Again, to be consistent with the argument that I presented, to say that this individual zygote, to leave this zygote soulless would be cruel, because what if this zygote dies before he or she splits? No possibility of redemption. It's been left out of the plan of God by not having a soul. Cruel. Can't do it. All right, so this, we do it for the consistency of the argument. This zygote, this original zygote, the precursor zygote, has to have a soul. But then how do we get 2 souls from that one? This is what I'm proposing. At the moment of split, God will grant another soul. In other words, what I'm saying is that this original soul, let's say, stayed with twin 1. Twin 2 is a new individual. At the point of new individuality, God would then grant a soul to the second individual. Whenever that second individual arises, God would grant a soul to that second individual. It's consistent with the argument. Because before, you see here, we still have a single individual. And even here, until they actually become 2 individuals, God does not really have to grant a soul. It's still 1 individual with 1 soul. The moment that second individual individuates, it becomes substantially different, has the proper matter by him or herself to be ensouled, God ensouls. All right? And the only quandary is that we will never know of the twins, of the monozygotic twins, we would never know who had the original soul or who got the later soul. we don't know who was the original, who came first or who came second, you know. But
I wonder if it's related who was born first.
Yeah, right, exactly. Exactly. You first. No, you first, please.
Well, how when we can detect a heartbeat?
That's not till 6 to 8 weeks.
Exactly.
5 weeks.
Yes. And even before detecting the heartbeat, we know that the myoblasts begin to form at about 18 days, at about 18 days, which is barely 2.5 weeks, right? 14, it's not even 21 days. I've heard that in the human it's about 18 days. So the cardiac cells, the cardiac precursors, is cardiac muscle. We have 3 types of muscle, right? We have the smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, and the cardiac muscle, right? Skeletal muscle is attached to bone, and that's how we can move our skeleton, and those are voluntary muscles. The smooth muscle is involuntary, not attached to bone, rigged up with the involuntary nervous system, and it's mostly the digestive tract, for example, and so forth. We have no control over those, but they do their function. And the third type of muscle is the cardiac muscle, of which only the heart is made up, the cardiac muscle, okay? Now, that cardiac muscle has an extra characteristic. Those cells, the myoblasts of the cardiac muscle, is that they have a self-beating pulse. They have a pulse of their own. Aside from being wired to the nerves that reinforce that pulsing, but they beat on their own. And this has been discovered not necessarily human, all mammals and vertebrates and everybody else who has a heart. Okay, in the early embryonic stage, you have the individual myoblasts who are beating on their own. They start palpitating, okay, and at some point when they start congregating, aggregating, and coalescing, that individual beating synchronizes, and then they start beating synchronized, and the tissue then synchronizes, which is amazing. And that's all has to be done with a biochemical signal. It's a very mechanical thing. Again, there's no mystery or magic. That is a biochemical signaling that happens with these cells to start beating in synchrony, which is the cardiac tissue, which eventually become the heart. But if we say at heartbeat, all right, even before sonogram can detect the heartbeat, all right, then we're advocating delayed ensoulment. Because like I say, it happens around 18 days. So what if that embryo dies on day 10 or 12 or 14? Soulless, again, the cruel thing. You follow?
What about, Father, when there's an embryonic pregnancy, that there's no fetal pole, but there's the gestational sac?
Yes.
What happened to the fetus? And is a positive ACG pregnancy? Yes.
It's a very rare case, but basically what's missing is the ICM, no? It seems to be missing the ICM because there's an implantation, there's a sac,
right?
Okay, so there's a trophoblast, but it seems to be missing an ICM. So it could be that the early ICM was so deformed or got reabsorbed. Some very strange things can happen in nature, and I'll show you with fetal reabsorption in a minute, some actual photographs of very strange things that are real, okay? But we can also say that maybe this embryo died early. You know, it was reabsorbed. Let's say that the ICM gets, whoops. See, that's why I don't like this feature. The ICM get, so let's say a solid zygote, morula, blastocyst, by the time it implants, there's only the trophoblast left, so you have the sac, but there's nothing inside. Well, it means that this ICM somehow died and got reabsorbed. So the human being died within 1 week or 5 days of conception.
So, but you definitely cannot have like that empty sac unless you had a fertilized egg at some point.
Right, yeah, because, yeah, I'm assuming that.
I was never 100%.
Yeah, I don't go that far into the clinical aspect because I don't have it. I don't have the competency, okay? But I'm assuming if there's a sac, that sac comes from the trophoblast. It's a logical place, it's a logical tissue that would make a sac. But the sac is empty, meaning that at some point the ICM died and got reabsorbed. No? I'm just kind of thinking out loud here with you. You're giving me the scientific evidence in the sonogram that there's a sac and nothing in it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So I'm thinking that it's a very early case of reabsorption. I had not considered it, but it makes sense. Anyway, I'm just positing here that we can take care of monozygotic twinning and maintaining the individuality of the soul when that second individual actually becomes an individual, materially speaking, biologically speaking. At that point, God would grant a soul. And what's wrong with that? You know, it's consistent with the argument. And the only thing is we would never know of the two twins who was the first, okay? But the window, like I say, is up to 2 weeks, which to me is extremely late. Sorry?
It can also be before. Right?
It can be before, right. It can be all the way from, yeah.
Maybe God gives them two souls because he knows that eventually they're going to split. They're meant to be two souls.
Yes, but the challenge is to have two souls in one body. You see? So we have to maintain consistency with the argument. Now, God knows exactly from all eternity when and how and where this was going to happen. Of all the human beings of the 7 billion, all right? And the ratio, by the way, is not that small. I think it's 1 in 64 or something for monozygotic twinning, so it's not extremely rare. Yes, identical twins? Yeah, it's like 1 in, I remember that number from when I was doing my research in the 90s. It's 1 in 64 is the ratio of monozygotic twins. In other words, 1 in every 64 human pregnancies, which is pretty high. You know, it's almost 2 per 100. Okay, what next? Yes. Now, some challenges. When do we have 2 individuals? Here are some, this is the extreme case of monozygotic is the conjoined twins, all right? In other words, normal monozygotic separate and grow as 2 individuals. But in conjoined, it's an extreme case, they don't separate fully. They separate in different parts of the body, but not fully. However, we can still maintain individuality. So this was the kind of a simpler case of monozygotic. Look at this. These are Natalie, Hope, and Adeline Faith Mata. I think they're from Guatemala or they're Hispanic girls. And this is what they look like, early babies. Pretty conjoined, huh? And they were separated. Here they are separated. Amazing. And here's a diagram of what they were sharing. But they, thanks be to God, they had double of everything. There were 2 hearts, there were 2 livers, 4 lungs. So they were able to be separated. It was a dramatic, talk about drama, dramatic surgery that was done. Of course, here they're clothes. You know, if we see them naked, we'll probably see for sure a lot of scarring, maybe some abnormality, physiological abnormality, okay? However, thanks be to God, they don't have to walk around naked. They can always be dressed. But they had 2 of everything of the internal organ or the vital organs, and so they were split, okay? In this case, it's the head that is fused as opposed to the body. But you can see here, there are also 2 individuals. Even the prosopon, the face, is very human-like, just on the shape of it. But I think that we will maintain that these are 2 individuals, especially if the brains are fairly intact. And what they're sharing is mostly a fused crania. The 2 crania are fused. This is another dramatic case of where they were not able to be split because they share internal organs. These are actual live human beings. The Hensel sisters. And here there was only 2 heads. Only 2 heads. From the neck down, it was 1. 1 support system. Okay? So necessarily they have to live together. But you can see them living together. Now, would you say that that's 1 individual or 2 individuals?
Different personalities.
Yes. You're going on the psychological aspect, which is interesting and good. Personality is a stem from person, right? And their faces certainly reveal 2 personalities, the prosopon, the mask, but the support system. So organically, everything from the neck down is a support system of the head. Okay, so these are 2 individuals with 2 souls. And God will figure it out. Yeah, but they're certainly alive and they're very famous for this because they're in the internet all over. Now, in fact, monozygotic twinning has been, conjoined twinning has been studied systematically to where the gastrula splits. So here is what is known as the embryonic disc. The embryonic disc is on the gastrula as the gastrula lengthens out. Remember, after implantation, the ICM now begins to become oblong, like a little pear shape or like an oval shape rather, but there will be a head region and a tail region. And you start with that primary design of tail and length. So we could talk about a dorsal and a ventral side, and anterior and posterior, and so forth. And that is the central disc represented here, the embryonic disc. Depending on where the split happens, how the conjoining will be. So you can see, I don't know if I can make this a little bigger. Let me try. Oh yeah, great. Well, a little bit. See the central disc here, the embryonic disc, and it has a second attached to it. Depending on where that second embryonic disc or how it splits here, for example, it's split tail to tail, all right? Here is head to head, and this is the end product. It will be fused at the cranii, but from there on out, we have two individuals. Here they would be fused at what is our original ventral side, which is the anal side, right? The end of the vertebral column. And from there on out, you would have two individuals. If the split happens further in from the ventral, then you're going to get, from the posterior end, you're going to get this kind of split where they share the lower part of the body, but the upper part would be individualized and very prominent two different hearts and so forth. So here are all the different possibilities, whether the split is ventral or dorsal, and then further subcategories. And truly, to me, the most, so I think the Hensel's are Rustle, but the most challenging would be something like this, where the two heads are actually fused. Then do we have one or two individuals? But here is diagrammatic. We have to ask the question, are these actually viable in pregnancy? You know, will they survive 9 months of pregnancy? And I think that thanks be to God, they don't. Because the abnormality is so gross that it's not sustainable, it's not viable. And so God can figure it out. We don't have to deal with a born human. And if they are born, they typically don't last too long at birth. You know, it could be days, it could be weeks. So the conjoined is a challenge, but basically, in my opinion, as long as the head is more or less intact, in other words, that the brain has the capacity to receive a soul, then it will have a soul. So again, matter and form, we'd have to limit it to the head. So there's an explanation for conjoined. The only challenge in conjoined twinning is when we push to the extreme case, then we have to ask the very practical question, are they viable or not? Because we can think of them theoretically by distribution of tissue, but in real life, are they viable or not? Okay. Now, one that is even more challenging is a twin reabsorption, or vanishing twin in the sonogram parlance. And also something called parasitic twin, which is not exactly the same, but existentially, as far as the soul, as far as ensoulment is concerned, it has the same end result. Here's a sonogram, for example, of one little fellow and a vanishing twin here. In other words, what used to be another twin, another human being that got reabsorbed, died and got reabsorbed. So I said the key question, I said the key word already. Here's some extreme examples. This one is less severe than this one, in my opinion. Again, looking at ensoulment, but you can see that these are actual photographs. So something was growing on the back of this, looks like a girl, right? That was human-like. But do you think that this would receive a soul? Does this matter? Just our intuition, and we can tell pretty much this was the dorsal side, this was the head side. That could have been rudimentary eye forming, and this was ventral, mid-region, and some kind of appendage, okay, that got fused. Maybe this was the gut region. But do you think that God would deposit a soul on this creature?
Does that mean that it didn't like ever separate entirely? Like there was never two zygotes? Is that what that means?
Well, so this is a twin, right? This is a monozygotic twin. This is a conjoined twin. But the question is this human? It's human tissue, but it's a human being, a human person.
But at what, we had two cycles at one point or not? Or we don't know?
Exactly. So, no, I think that this was a single zygote that split, so it's a monozygotic twinning. But one of the twins got reabsorbed by the other twin. This lady.
So the second one never got a soul because
Okay.
it wasn't sustained. Life wasn't sustained.
Right. Well, so in my opinion, I don't know if it got a soul or not, but I would say this. If this second twin, at some point in his or her life, had the matter, sufficient matter to receive a soul, it may have been, let's assume that when do you want the split to happen? At the blastocyst or the gastrula? Those are the two, or morula. Morula, blastocyst, or gastrula. My intuition is that it happened later rather than earlier, not at the morula, because at the morula they would pretty much have been even. And even the blastocyst, I think it was at the embryonic disc. If there's an embryonic disc, we're beyond the blastocyst. It's already implantation. We're at the gastrula level, right? So let's say it happened at the gastrula level. So we end up with two gastrulae, okay? And one gastrula is this lady, which at least from the back looks pretty normal, and I'm sure from the front she's normal. And this other tissue thing would be the other embryonic disc, right? Let's go back for a moment. See, we have two embryonic discs, probably one extreme case, I don't even know where to put it. An extreme case of this, all right? But the other one, this other individual did not develop enough, did not have enough matter to receive a soul.
Right. When you divide, it didn't have enough matter.
Yes, it did not have enough matter. It had some of the matter of a human, but not all of the matter of a human. You see? And so, in my opinion, did not receive a soul because that matter was not ready to receive a soul.
Or fully divided, fine.
Fully divided,
It
fine.
was not a condition because it stayed in that body because that body was feeding.
Yes, it's truly parasitic.
Right.
It's a parasite.
It doesn't have an individual.
Yeah. So another way of considering it could be an extension. It's a parasitic extension of the one individual that did survive. In other words, there was not enough genetic expression to make this second thing human, fully human, you know, to a point of receiving a soul.
But then what is the difference between that concept that didn't have enough to receive a soul,
right,
to the spontaneous miscarriages where the baby, like not miscarriages, spontaneous abortion where the mother doesn't even know that there was fertilization, but it didn't have enough matter or correct.
No, there's no difference. In other words, for a spontaneous abortion, the scenario would be this. At fertilization, God granted a soul. Now, assuming that it did have, but the defects, okay, I see what you're saying. The defects were at the level of detail. It was not viable with life, but was a human being, okay? And so, for example, an aneuploidy of another chromosome other than 21, okay? You still have the other genes and the other genetic load that is basically intact, but was not compatible with life. So that individual died early on, and was a spontaneous abortion.
So why can't that be the same for this case?
Yes, but what I'm trying to say is I don't really know. It's just that this case looks so abnormal, okay, that it's a growth. So it does not have enough matter. It does get philosophical, but the matter has to have sufficient matter to be informed as a human. We'll never really know. It's in the mystery of God. We don't know. And even the spontaneous abortions, we don't know how many of those are truly human. Okay? We can assume that some are. And even if, because it could be also on the part of the mother that didn't accept the embryo, but the embryo was basically good to go. But something happened in the mother. She just wasn't able to hold that pregnancy. So it's on the mother's side. You know, just kind of thinking out loud here. But the embryo, so the embryo died early. Who cares? In other words, as long as we don't put a minimal time for being human and to belonging to God and to spend eternity, we can spend eternity as a zygote. It's kind of challenging because we're not used to thinking in those terms. But why couldn't a zygote be in heaven? If he was human, has a soul, right? It's possible. It's speculative, but it's possible. Now, in contrast, so how about this individual? It's looking more and more human, right? We really don't know, but my suspicion is that internally it's not fully human. It has the shape of a face, highly abnormal face, but I'm wondering if there's any contact, if there's even an eyeball. Maybe there is an eyeball because there seems to be a protrusion there, but is that eyeball connected to the brain? And that's still just a sense, you know, one of the organs, sensory organs. How about the brain itself? Certainly, well, look at the brain of this child and look at the brain of this individual here. It's at least twice as large.
There's a body there?
There's no,
It's only
just the head, just the head. Yeah, it's the second head. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh my goodness. Oh, why is it so?
Yeah,
Oh.
It ends there.
It ends there.
Yeah, oh, I'm sorry, it's not coming out clear at all. Let's try to make it a little darker. Yeah, someone close that door and someone else close the curtain in the back. Yeah, I can see it very well in the computer, but here it's not very well. It may have to do with, yeah, let me make it smaller. It's a head with a face, but we don't know what's inside. It does. It has a mouth, a nose, an eye. Might even have an orbit. Come around because you can see it much more clearly on the computer itself. Look at that.
Yeah, it has a nose.
See? Yeah. Okay. So it's got hair, it's got a nose, a mouth, some teeth sticking out. It looks like it has a smile, but it can't really be a smile, you know. It's got eyes with maybe an orbit. There's no body for sure. But look at the size of the head itself, of the cephalum of the brain is about twice the size of this one. So it's hydrocephalic, probably hydrocephalic inside, full of fluid, right? It has, but those are all external features. Those are external features. You know, we can think of a person who is missing an eye, a person who got his nose cut off and all this, still human. But in this case, what's inside? What's inside? We'll never really know.
Yeah. Fluid of the ventricles, like you said.
Yes, exactly. This looks like hydrocephalus. Or it could be tissue. So we would never really know. Yes, exactly. So definitely we have to favor the little baby on the left, right? Who looks healthy enough from the head down, from the cranium, and he would have to undergo some radical head surgery. But the little baby on the left looks very viable. So that's the point. We will never really know if this was at some point a human being or not. Okay. But certainly now it's an appendage and it's totally parasitic on the circulatory system and the nourishing system of the baby. And it can be very taxing. So this thing has to be separated because over time it's going to tax this baby as far as nourishing this mass, all right? So twin reabsorption, in my opinion, is the greatest challenge to positing immediate ensoulment, but there's a way around it by way of if we consider that death. So here's kind of a diagram of how we can look at it. With monozygotic twins, we start with one soul at the zygote level, and then at some point within 14 days in the human, this early embryo splits. At the time of the split, then we have a second soul. Just a summary diagram. There will be an argument consistent biologically, philosophically, and theologically. With reabsorption, we start with one soul again at the zygote level. There's a split to two souls, possibly, if the second human was human enough to receive a soul, and only God knows, right? God would grant a soul. We assume that God would grant a soul because God would not leave anyone soulless. At some point, when the reabsorption occurs or the resorption occurs, that second individual dies and goes to his or her destiny according to God's plan. So the second soul leaves that tissue, which then gets reabsorbed partially or completely by the other twin, by the living twin, who continues with his or her soul. I think that this could work as long as we don't require a minimal time to be alive in order to qualify for being human, for having a soul. It could be 1 minute, 1 hour, 1 day, or 1 century, like in the case of Meyer. Okay? As long as we don't put a minimal time limit to be alive after fertilization, to be qualify for being human, and therefore God depositing a soul, we have it. It's extreme, but I'm giving you basically an argument of logical consistency for positing the soul at fertilization, so it will be immediate ensoulment. And all I'm trying to do with this, with excess of detail and argument, is to maintain the humanity of the human embryo from conception to birth and beyond. You know. Now, I would just like to get in front of the Supreme Court for those who are naysayers and present this. Okay, so the big summary is fertilization in place, in locus, at the ampulla. Within 5 to 7 days, the early embryo migrates and implants and continues the development. By the way, here's another challenge, grammatical challenge, and in dialogue. Existential. We continue to refer to the early embryo as it. The zygote, the morula, the blastula, etc., even the early embryo and the fetus, it. However, that is precisely the one thing that a human being can never be, is an it. Because we're either he or she, genetically from the moment of fertilization. So even the zygote is never an it. For the human specifically, we are always he or she. But, and you can hear even the most pro-lifers will talk about the early embryo as it. Okay, it is human. We argue that it is human, it is fully human. But we're undermining ourselves by saying that the early embryo is an it. We fall into that trap. And so we're already objectivizing, we're making the embryo a thing instead of a human, instead of a subject.
It's true.
Mm-hmm.
You have the sex.
Exactly, because the sex is determined at fertilization. Exactly. And therefore, he or she is not an it. But try to refer to the early embryo as a he or a she. And it's challenging.
Baby. The baby.
You can say baby, but again, you know, trying to be honest with the language, we typically talk about a baby when the baby is born. We can talk about the unborn baby or just the unborn. The unborn is, we can talk about the unborn as sexless, but then the unborn is generic. It's all 9 months. If we want to talk about the zygote, we should talk about he or she, the zygote, or she or he, the zygote. And
even the fetus.
yes. Right.
The fetus girl, I mean, it's the fetus.
Right. It's a fetus, kind of objectively, you know, as an it. Yes, right. So this is the challenge that I find in that level is referring to the early embryo particularly, but at any stage of development, as he or she instead of an it, because then that begins to humanize the zygote. When I talk about the zygote as he or she, it makes people think, he or she, well, it is not truly human. Oh, yes, it is. He or she is, right? So going back to he or she humanizes and personalizes the early embryo in particular. Okay? Yes, a personal identity, a personalized identity.
Easier not to be there.
Yes, right. Yes. Sometimes I take a little step further, because precisely we know that the abortionist agenda comes from a radical feminist mentality, and it can be a little awkward at times to talk about he or she, he or she, he or she. I just say she, because unless the SIR gene kicks in, you know, those gonads will develop into ovaries and the female reproductive tract, because the X chromosome is always there. So unless there is a Y chromosome that is functional, the zygote will develop into a female. So I just refer as she. And then they don't know if I'm talking about she, the embryo, or she, the mother, because they think I'm talking about she, the mother. No, I'm talking about she, the embryo. The other she, the other female. Anyway, okay, so in the drama of today's lecture, I ended with a little comedy. Now we're going to stop and take a break. We're 11, because then we're going to go into abortion in the second part of the lecture, okay? Questions, comments? No? Ready for a little break? I am. Go thaw out for a moment outside. Yeah.
Hopefully the coffee will be warm.
Yes, thank you. We're going to try it. Okay, pause. I'm pausing now. Resume recording. There's a little dot. Welcome back. Now we're going to move forward into our actual first bioethical issue at the beginning of human life, none other than abortion, okay? And what I have been trying to do in the past 2 lectures and the first half of this one is to establish finally that at fertilization, which we call normally conception also, we may have it's the most logical place for concluding that we have a new human being, new human individual with a soul, his or her soul from the zygote forward. Now, how do we deal with abortion in light of that? And first, the biology of abortion, if you will, or the clinical part of it. There's some terminology that we have to look at. And then we have to look at some methods also, at least in general, all right? Without too much graphic detail here, because it's not the purpose of the course. And then finally, some alternatives, healthy alternatives to abortion. We have to make the first distinction, always distinguish in abortion, it came out kind of small, that
I think you have to do the screen father to show the pictures better.
do it back to screen view. Okay, let's try that. That? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So bioethically speaking, we can split all abortions into spontaneous abortions or procured abortions. In one, the will is not engaged, and the other one, the will is engaged, all right? So we have these two great faculties that are part of our soul, or the actions of our soul, is the intellect and the will. The capacity to reason precisely to the level that we do with abstract thought, the level of understanding substances, and the closest creature to us, biologically speaking, genetically speaking, we know is Pan, troglodytes, right? Otherwise known as the chimpanzee, has no clue that he or she is looking at substances. When the monkey looks around, when the chimpanzee looks around, I think it's pretty intuitive that they don't have a notion of substance, of the nouns, okay, of things. But we do. So that's part of one of the characteristics of the soul, if you will, is our intellect, all the way up to abstract thinking, of being able to communicate essences. And the other one is the will, which then will take us to action, even internal action. For example, at the level of desire, when there's a desire, the will has acted already internally. And that's why Jesus is capable of condemning our ill will. When we act, when we desire something evil on someone else or even ourselves, we have already sinned in our hearts, says Jesus, a heart meaning the conscience, because of the will, without touching anyone else, without doing anything physically to anyone else, all right? So here is precisely whether the will is engaged or not. We know that in a spontaneous abortion, it happens. Typically, there are so many abnormalities that embryo is not viable, or when it's later in the term, then it's called a miscarriage. It's simply a technical change in name, but again, the miscarriage is spontaneous, and it's not procured, it's natural, and it's part of natural selection. It's part of the way that nature has to clean our species, if you will, so that most of us at birth are as normal as we can be, because the abnormals really got selected out early on. Obviously, there is no ill will there. In fact, typically there is even sadness for a couple to lose their child, and they feel sad, they feel depressed, and has to be some counseling involved and so forth, for miscarriage especially. Most spontaneous abortions happen early on. I mentioned maybe up to 90%, if not more, of the deaths happen early on. Again, I remember when I was doing my research back in the 90s on this topic, that the human has one of the highest rates of spontaneous abortion or miscarriage in nature. Globally, it could be up to 50%. 50% of all pregnancies never make it to term, spontaneously, not procured, spontaneously, okay? So we can estimate that there's twice as many humans as we can count. The other half are in God's mercy because they died early. And again, about 90% of those who die in the womb happen early on, even within the first couple of weeks, right before or around implantation, which is a very crucial event, biologically speaking. If they get discarded, sometimes a woman doesn't even know she had a spontaneous abortion. She just thinks that she missed her period and she's late, and she was actually having an early abortion with a little embryo who didn't implant, okay? So 50% is globally, depending on who you read and how they classify it. And also to note that many of these are not documented, because how do you document this, right? Especially the early ones, it's not documented. But for the ones who have been documented and for the ones who have been actually analyzed in the lab, the vast majority of them carry some gross genetic or chromosome abnormalities, and therefore not compatible with life, and that's enough. Procured abortions, which are also known as elective or induced, when they try to minimize the ethical or the moral impact of it, right? It's my election, it's my choice. This, definitely the will is engaged, and the woman, the pregnant mom, has gone into an abortion clinic somehow, or gotten the abortion pill, and this is willed. This is willed, okay? And this is the one on which we are passing the bioethical analysis, and saying that is not acceptable from the analysis that we're doing. So we're going to get into procured or elective or induced abortions. First, to be clear, abortifacients that the federal government does not classify as abortifacients, but rather as contraceptives, and therefore, according to Obamacare, which is still standing, they need to be covered by insurance and all this. This is one of the controversies. These are social controversies, bioethics. not only the pill, the contraceptive pill, which is an extra dosage of mostly estrogen, but combination. When there is ovulation, when there is, it's known as breakthrough ovulation. In other words, it can happen that a woman who is on the pill gets pregnant. Let's say that the ratio of efficiency is 99%. Well, 1 in 100 women on average are getting pregnant on the pill. and they are compliant. They're being compliant. In other words, they're taking it every day at the same time of day and so forth, every day religiously, taking the pill, and 1 of 100 get pregnant in a 99% rate. Let's say you put it at 99.9%, which is not. When you read the typical indication of the pill, it's going to say about 98 to 99%, all right, maybe 99.5. Well, if it's 98%, it's 2 women per 100, so it's 1 per 50. Getting pregnant on the pill, getting pregnant. So how do you figure that? It's called breakthrough ovulation. In other words, nature is so tenacious, nature is so stubborn, nature is trying to produce an egg, even with the excess amount of estrogen, all right, that is telling the follicles to shut down and not ovulate. Still, nature overrides that somehow and produces a mature egg. And so, if they're having intercourse, that mature egg, on average, is going to get fertilized, and that's why 1% or 2% or 0.5%, whatever, get pregnant on the pill, all right? But because the excess dosage of the hormones also has an effect on the endometrium, which had thickened in the meantime to accept a possible implantation, it also has effect that it sloughs off that endometrium, meaning that it makes the uterus inhospitable to the pregnancy. And so that's the abortifacient aspect of the contraceptive pill. You see, when there is breakthrough ovulation, the woman is actually pregnant, doesn't know it because it's the first week. That little embryo is traveling, the blastocyst seeks to implant and finds an inhospitable uterus, will be discarded. That woman just had an abortion. You can say, well, but that's a spontaneous abortion because it was all natural, the endometrium just naturally sloughs off. No, there was a will engaged in taking that pill, okay? So really, by taking the pill, the woman does not want to get pregnant. And if she ends up pregnant and discarding the embryo, then philosophically and theologically and existentially and ethically, that was a procured abortion because she should have known that there can be breakthrough ovulation, that otherwise that 99% efficiency has a meaning, has an ethical meaning. A woman taking the pill has to know that she has a chance, a 1% chance of getting pregnant taking the pill. Okay, and still takes it, meaning that she's willing to risk having the consequence of discarding that embryo, therefore a procured abortion, a willed abortion.
I've heard, I don't know if it's a myth or if it's true, that a baby can be born with an IUD on the head.
First time I hear it, but I wouldn't doubt it. An IUD stuck on the head, or some part.
No, with the mark
or the actual gets stuck, the tissue absorb it. Yeah, anything can happen. I've never heard of it, but now that you mention it, have you seen that on a sonogram?
I've seen it on probably an X-ray or MRI.
There it is. Yeah, absolutely. Think of it because of the tenacity, right? The tenacity of nature.
And nowadays, also they say that some, initially it was called the copper tea.
Right, the copper tea.
Now, the argument that they're trying to say is that there is no copper anymore, so they're not putting anything that is going to cause the abortion. So they're trying to justify the use of the tea,
right?
By saying that it doesn't have copper anymore,
and therefore is not an abortive agent. Right.
I've also seen it that it perforates the uterus.
It can do that. I guess it's synthetic now, typically mostly plastic. I understand that the teas now, many times, they also have slow release hormone on the tips, all right, to act also as a contraceptive chemically. So it's a combination, mechanical and chemical. But in principle, what the copper T or the IUD does, intrauterine device, what it does is, see, because it's touching the endometrium, it fools the endometrium into thinking that it's pregnant, basically. Okay, stimulating the endometrium as if it were an implantation, and therefore it will trigger hopefully, or that's the expectation, that it will trigger the hormones to signal the ovaries, okay, stop ovulating because now we have a pregnancy. All right, okay? So it fools the endometrium, the uterus, into thinking it's pregnant, and therefore that through the pituitary gland will send signals to the ovary, stop ovulating because it worked already, you know, we have a pregnancy, which is not true. But if there is breakthrough ovulation, and if there is pregnancy, and there is an embryo traveling, trying to implant, he or she will not be able to implant because the endometrium has become inhospitable to another implantation. Okay? And therefore, again, causing an abortion. So they are abortifacient. However, because the federal government on the previous administrations became so ideological in this, especially the FDA, which is the one that controls this stuff, right? Interesting that the FDA controls food and medication because it comes through the mouth, Food and Drug Administration. They have to certify that these things are suitable for human consumption. They are defining pregnancy as implantation. That's why I say ideology is trumping, sorry for the pun, but ideology is overriding biology, okay? Because implantation is 5 to 7 days after fertilization, after the human is already present and so forth. But they say, well, if there's no pregnancy, then there's no human.
And that device doesn't allow it to implant.
Exactly, in principle, doesn't allow it to implant, and therefore there's no pregnancy, and therefore it's a contraceptive. Because they're saying contraceptive is preventing implantation, which is a big lie. Okay, it did not prevent conception because there was breakthrough and an early abortion. And then the morning after is even more gruesome. When the morning after is 2 pills, typically you take 1 pill, not you, the pregnant woman takes a pill the day after the intercourse, if she thought she had been ovulating, and a few hours later she takes a second one. Typically it's a 2 dosage thing, and what this typically does, again, if it may act as a contraceptive, it's a mega dose. I think it's like a 10-time dosage of a contraceptive pill. It's just a huge mega dose of estrogen or progesterone to try to trigger a sloughing off. Well, contraceptive if it can, if fertilization has not happened yet, because fertilization can happen up to 5 days, right, after the intercourse, after the ovulation. But if fertilization has happened, again, it makes the endometrium inhospitable and therefore causing an early abortion. This is kind of a statistical thing. The sooner the woman takes the pill, the morning after pill, then the more likely it will work as a contraceptive. The more she waits, 1, 2, or 3 days after the intercourse, the more likely it will work as an abortifacient rather than a contraceptive, okay? But she still has that window up to about 4 or 5 days of making the endometrium inhospitable, even if there is an early embryo, which is not acting as a contraceptive at all, it's acting as an abortifacient. It's also known as Plan B. Levonorgestrel gestrel is the actual chemical. Now you can buy this over the counter. You can buy this in a drugstore. You walk in family planning section, there they have them, okay? Over the counter. Now, the procured abortion itself, some terminology. This is from Keith Moore, which is pretty much a standard embryology book in many medical schools in the US and throughout the world. I don't know what edition it is now, but periodically it's updated. These are just medical terminology. Threatened abortion, when there is bleeding. And so this is looking at the clinical symptoms of the woman. The abortion has not happened itself, but it's threatened, meaning that she's bleeding excessively. And then there should be a protocol for that to try to prevent the abortion. But this is more looking at a possible spontaneous abortion or miscarriage. Okay? Spontaneous abortion we talked about. Habitual abortion, again, it's another clinical term of a woman who typically has recurring spontaneous abortions and cannot hold a pregnancy. All right. Induced abortion is the one that we're talking about, the willful one here. Now, he has it before 20 weeks, but we know that in the United States, this is no longer valid. In the United States, it's up to birth for the whole 9 months. A woman can have an induced abortion. Of course, after the first trimester, she needs some kind of a medical clearance, medical reason. But the reason can be a threat to her life, a threat to her health, but the health includes emotional health. So that's the loophole where you can fit a truck in. In other words, emotional health is, I don't want this pregnancy. It's an inconvenient. It ruins my lifestyle. I just don't want this parasite inside. I want it out. And therefore, that's the emotional distress. And any pro-abortion doctor is willing to certify that. And then she can go forward with the procured abortion. Okay. Complete abortion, of course, all the products of conception are expelled. Again, this is clinically extremely important because an incomplete abortion will leave some segment inside that can become infected. It can cause hemorrhage and can kill the mother, can cause sepsis on the mother, right? Missed abortion is when the fetus stays inside, or the embryo, and was not vacated. There is the extreme of this missed abortion. Again, this is talking about a spontaneous abortion. So here you see they're kind of mixed, but this one is a spontaneous abortion, missed, meaning that the fetus or the embryo died but did not come out. If there's a second pregnancy or if there were twins and one of the two died, there is something called papilliform fetus. I don't know if you've ever seen a papilliform fetus. The dead fetus gets pushed to the side and the other fetal pushes in and they become thin like that, like a piece of paper. That, of course, is just the cadaver of the poor fellow. But it's interesting that even this can happen. Papilliform, meaning in the shape, you see here's form, which is bad, incorrectly used. No, why is he giving me this? I was looking at the columns in Alexandria. That's interesting. That I was looking for. Papilliform is a reference to paper that they're flattened. Let's see. Oh, I don't know what I'm looking for. I don't know what else to put. That's the term that is used. It's so rare, it's not showing. Oh, okay, I don't want to delay. I'll find it next time and show it to you. But if they're twins, you found, what did you put in? What did you?
No, the baby holding the
tea.
Oh, the tea? Oh, you got the,
he was born
In his hands?
with an IUD. The baby was born with an IUD.
Against all odds.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, look at that.
Yeah.
Wow, and upset. Yeah. Okay.
Wow.
Okay, I'll look it up. I don't want to spend some time. I guess it's the terminology is not coming up. But this is a case of misabortion. Let's say, for example, you have twins. One of the twins dies and is not vacated, will stay inside. The other twin will continue to grow and push the cadaver against the wall and partially reabsorb some of the tissue and the fluids. And so what is left is just like a fetus, but it's a paper shape, so flattened out. Dead, of course, cadaver.
But it's a natural.
It's a natural occurrence, yes, it's a natural death, right?
So misabortion is
It's spontaneous, it's in the spontaneous category, yeah. A miscarriage, again, we talked about, is after, well, after the second trimester when they change its name into fetus, typically, all right, because then it's a more recognizable human being. Well, the numbers, since 1973, Roe versus Wade, there are 60 million abortions procured abortions in the United States. Okay, that's more than all the wars in history.
There's another word here, botch.
Yeah, botched abortion.
Oh, botched, yes. Well, botched would be an incomplete abortion. Exactly.
Is it spontaneous or?
No, it's procured. It's procured when they left part of the, yes, a botched abortion is when they didn't do it correctly or they didn't expel all the products of the abortion, the parts of the fetus. That's why the nurse has to be on the side and reassembling the parts of the fetus to make sure that they got all the parts out. Oh yeah, it's a very gruesome thing. This gets me into the different types of abortions, all right? Again, without going into much detail, but we have to know a little bit of the terminology. First of all, there are two types of abortions, either mechanical or chemical, all right? Chemical is earlier on. The chemical abortion, which is typically these two chemicals, either mifepristone or misoprostol. They're called medical abortions in the medical field, in the clinical field. Chemical abortions are called medical abortions, all right? And these are the two most common drugs used. Mifepristone, which is also known as RU486, and misoprostol, also known as Cytotec. So RU486 and Cytotec, these are the brand names. RU is from Russell Uclef, which is, I think is Swiss, the pharmaceutical, right? Russell Uclef. 486, I think, is the number of trials it took to get it right. Yeah, that's our RU486. It's like the two pill dosage. Cytotec is another one. That's the brand name, I believe. And these are the most common drugs, medications used in medical abortions, the chemicals. If the conceptus is a little further along, all right, in gestation, then it requires a surgical abortion. So if there's going to be a mechanical means, it will be a surgical abortion. Sometimes abortions, depending on the method, are a combination of both. They'll use chemicals, and then they go in with the mechanics. The chemicals will serve to kill the child, because if the child is extracted alive, then that same abortionist has to do everything in his or her power to revive that child who did not die in the womb, okay? So they typically use a chemical in second and third trimester to kill the embryo, or the fetus rather, before doing the abortion. So let's start and look at excuse me, some of the methods. We can divide the pregnancy in trimesters. For the first trimester, it's either, like I said, chemical or mechanical. On the mechanical, it's a vacuum. It's, in other words, the woman is dilated at the cervix, and a cannula, a tube, is inserted, and that tube will start suctioning out the endometrium with the embryo. And so that vacuum can either be electric or manual, depending on the case. And so that's the first type of abortion early on. If it's going to be chemical, it's down here, either mifepristone or RU486. Then a DNC. DNC is dilation and curettage. Dilation and curettage. The dilation aspect, which you see happens in every case from the beginning of the second trimester forward, right? Dilation is a reference to the cervix. The cervix, which is the circular muscle between the vagina and the uterus, has to be dilated because that cervix is closed shut when there's a pregnancy with a plug, so that the fetus or the embryo is not, so there's no interference from the outside into the womb, right? Well, that cervix has to be dilated, and then the instruments inserted for the extraction or the curettage. Curettage is a reference to a curette, which is a type of a scalpel, but has a circular point to cut. That is as sharp as a scalpel. But it's circular. For example, all right, these are curettes, and they're very sharp here on the tip. And what it does is it cuts the little fetus in sections, and then, yeah, and then they go and extract the fetus. Okay, so these are very sharp, and that's how they're used. So that's a DNC. You hear a DNC, dilation and curettage. It actually scrapes the endometrium and then extract it.
And that's used also to clean out for spontaneous.
Exactly. The products of conception can also, yes, when there's a spontaneous abortion or a natural death or a missed abortion.
Is there anything wrong with that?
No, because the fetus is dead, the embryo is dead, there's no heartbeat, there's no circulation. The sonogram contributes to see that there's no circulation, right?
And what about, can it cause damage to your uterus?
Well, it depends how it's done.
The risk is always perforation.
Yes.
So is the risk something against the Catholic Church? Like doing that?
No, I mean, it
No.
has to be done. It's medically necessary.
Right.
You have a miscarriage.
Mm.
Because what happened is otherwise you start bleeding.
That,
It
yeah,
can become infected.
I've heard people are like that have had issues doing it,
Well,
Mhm.
if it's like that.
wanting to do it, not wanting to do it.
There are some physicians that regardless whether it's a miscarriage, they won't do it. So they send you to other physicians. Particularly this after the first trimester. Because then, it's already a more formed fetus that they have. It's a personal decision of the physician whether they perform it or not.
Yes. It is a type of cleaning.
Because your body doesn't like discharge all
By itself.
Right, the endometrium did not get sloughed off naturally, and there can be some tissue left, which can become infected and cause sepsis.
People die from it.
It can die, yeah, it is life-threatening. So there is a certain level of risk. I mean, there's a level of risk in any medication, any medical procedure, okay? But the key question is, from the bioethical perspective, is the risk proportionate or disproportionate? Is the risk proportionate or not? Okay, and if the risk is proportionate, in other words, here's the health of the mother. Of course, if the fetus is dead already, then we're dealing with a cadaver, and that cadaver can be cut up in pieces. I mean, it's not the ideal, but it can be cut up in pieces and be taken out because there's no life anymore on the fetus part.
The soul is not there.
Exactly, the soul has left. At death, the soul has left.
Yeah, how come they make the mother deliver the baby natural when the baby is stillborn instead of either a C-section?
Right, because it's a more benevolent procedure. It's always the protocol of choice, I would say, in the good sense of the word choice. First of all, there's a miscarriage, meaning that the fetus is already dead, and a sonogram will corroborate that there is no heartbeat, for example, and circulation and so forth. So we have a cadaver, but the fetus is still retained. So they induce labor on the mother, if possible, especially if it's late. Also for practical reasons, because once the fetus is more developed, there's no curette that is going to cut through that bone, right? And so forth. Therefore, they try to induce labor because it's a more natural process. If she doesn't do the labor, right, then at some point they'll have to go in and take out the fetus because they cannot leave the cadaver inside, for sure. That would become rotten. It would rot and will contaminate the mother big time. Okay, so they try to avoid the C-sections, which, by the way, now that you mentioned C-section, might as well talk a little bit on it because before the C-section, the modern C-section, of course, cesarean section comes from Caesar, right? From Julius Caesar, apparently. So there's some evidence that it was performed even in ancient times. However, in modern times, the C-section is probably the one medical procedure that has enhanced lifespan of the woman substantially, because typically before the C-section, most women, the average lifespan of women was like in the 50s, because most women died in the last childbirth. They bled to death. And so the lifespan was done in the 50s, very disproportionate to the men, which was always in the 70s. Well, probably earlier was lower, also because of the wars, of the danger of going out and hunting and getting food and all that. At any rate, with the C-section, the life expectancy of women jumped to what it is today, around the 80s, late 70s or 80s. And so it's a great procedure and so forth, but keep in mind, originally it was vertical, first of all, and very drastic because it's cutting across all of the muscle tissue, perpendicular to the striation of the muscle, all right? And there are about 7 layers, I think, of muscle that they have to cut through. And then at some point, some physician thought of going, well, how about we go with the striation instead of perpendicular to it? And so now, sorry?
Fine and still.
Fine and still? Oh, yes.
The fine and still technique.
Ah, that's what it's called. Fine and still, huh? There you go. I didn't know that. Okay. Okay, how do you spell that? Fine and still? Fine as it sounds? Maybe? Maybe?
I don't in Spanish. I just
A ver.
Spanish.
Fine and still. That's thanks. I never knew the name of the doctor because that would also date it to a particular time. Still incision, probably. Oh, PF. Okay, it's sounding Swedish or something like that. Okay, PF, double N, and a third N. Fine and steel. Oh my goodness, real. Okay, let's do this. Yes, interesting. I'll look into Wikipedia when there's more time, but it's still like, okay, paste, there, incision. One is, okay. Okay. Right, so now it's horizontal and it's lower, and therefore a woman can have several. I think maybe 3 or 4, I don't know, up to 4. Okay, used to be 1 and that was it, but now up to 4, and it's still good. Having said that, I've also heard that about 50%, globally, 50% of the C-sections that are done in the US at least, are not indicated, not medically indicated. In other words, it's for convenience. There's no reason for it, other than the woman doesn't want to have the pain, the doctor doesn't want to have the risk.
C-sections are very painful.
Is it really?
Yeah.
No, okay,
Yeah,
wow.
The incisions, the stitches, it's very hard.
Wow.
Like something that's not spoken of, because some people don't have it so bad. I had 2 cousins that done it. One of them was walking and holding her baby the next day, no problem. But most women that I've seen that have had to do it, it's frustrating because they can't even get up. they're in so much pain from the incision because
Right.
it's cutting through your muscles.
Yes, yes.
So all that is like it takes a long time to recover, from my understanding, from what I've been told. And they can even get up at first, like the first week or even two sometimes to even pick up their baby.
Wow, look at that.
And
Couple of weeks, yeah.
From what I've been told, it's very painful.
Right.
But
Right.
it's so individual because
It is.
the pain is a very
It's
individual
different.
pain.
Mm.
So, some women is like really a minor procedure. Some women prefer to have that pain than going through labor.
Through labor, yes.
Labor is very
My sister-in-law was broke.
Exactly. Yeah,
She
no
had
kidding,
really
really?
twins.
Oh, yes. Yeah, one for each, no?
That's why emergency
Literally,
C-section,
what?
'cause
Oh.
the one on top wouldn't turn,
Ah,
and the doctor, I mean, he had to be NICU because the doctor was pushing on him so much that by the time he came out via C-section, he couldn't even breathe well.
wow.
But now I wonder if the C-sections that are being said that they're optional,
Right.
because from what I know, is a lot of times the doctors will say, even though it's not medically necessary,
Right.
because of the shape, the form of the hips, and the baby's weight, they'll say either you have to do C-section or we'll induce you earlier. So is that considered that
Early.
the woman is like opting for it, or
No, I think Father is right in that sense. Aesthetics, is there's a lot of overuse.
Overuse of C-section. Right.
So some are medically absolutely necessary.
then what about that? Like, what if it's not necessary? Like, the woman doesn't want to do it, the doctor suggested it because of the fighting baby. How is that? What does that?
So it's an option. It's called probabilism. In other words, there is some medical indication. Otherwise, the doctor wouldn't be recommending it. It may not be as risky as one that is absolutely necessary. Let's say an enlarged head or super small hip. Okay.
Or the placenta, the position of the
Placenta previa, or yes, creta, right? The position of the placenta.
They're like, oh no, the baby's maybe too big, so either C-section or we induce it early.
Yeah.
Is that why?
Yeah, exactly.
I guess there's.
Yeah, there would be some medical indication there. You see.
Because of the liability issue,
That's
the
what's
physician
issue.
would rather not go for, taking any chances.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Supposedly, again, statistically, it's less risky to have a C-section than to have a labor itself. It's more complicated. The issue of meconium and everything else, breathing some of the fluid, the baby breathing, and so forth. And then they are suable, right? So the OBGYNs are getting sued left and right.
Yeah.
That is one of the most suable professions, unfortunately. Very sad. So anyway, it's something to deal with, but we can say that on the extreme, there is a whole set of pregnant moms who are electing for a C-section, and there's no medical indication, but yet the insurance does cover it, because as long as the doctor certifies on it, and of course, the doctor will be happy to do that because it's less exposure, right, to a soup. Anyway, the challenges are there. Okay, let's go back here for a while. We looked at, we still have to cover a little bit more on the different types of abortions, because we were into the second trimester now, beyond the DNC. At some point, that fetus is going to get a little too large and the bones calcified so that the curette is not going to work, and they have to be extracted whole. Or there's one procedure where they just, never mind the curette, they go in with a set of essentially pliers, stainless steel pliers, and just pluck sections of the fetus out piece by piece, and that's the one that the nurse has to reassemble. So that's dilation and evacuation. Many times when they do there is with sonogram guidance, they will inject the heart with a large dose of potassium chloride, just basically induce a heart attack, a cardiac arrest on the fetus, and then take out the sections. Or if the fetus is way too large and those bones are not going to give and the joints are not going to give by just pulling on them, then is an intact extraction. Intact extraction is the D and X, where the fetus is just extracted intact. When chemicals are used for inducing the miscarriage, that's the induced miscarriage there. Okay. And typically here's where they kill the fetus first. Typically potassium chloride is what I think they use on the heart. So this is from the second trimester on. In the third trimester, the most extreme case is the DNX, which is also known as partial birth abortion. And the extra step of the DNX is that because the human fetus is not a legal person until that head comes out, then there's a technique for turning the fetus around to a breech position. Okay. Breech. So they have to make sure that the head doesn't come out so that the fetus is not legally protected, right? Nope, I think right here. Well, that's the partial birth abortion. Just for the second completion. I had it in another set of slides, but I think you've seen the diagrams. The issue is turning the fetus in a breech position. This is what, see, New York State just legalized this. It's been in the courts whether it was legal or not. There was a ban on partial birth abortion that went through Congress and was signed into law, but then the judiciary questioned its constitutionality, and it was still decided. It was undecided whether it was constitutional or not, because it puts a certain restriction on a specific type of abortion, partial birth abortion. Just quickly, we'll look at a diagram here. The fetus is turned to a breech position, meaning the feet first, and the feet are actually extracted. Part of the body is extracted, okay? And then the physician will insert a needle, a large bore needle through the cranium, through the acetabulum in the back of the brain, and literally suck out the brain. Suck out the brain, collapse the cranium, so it's a craniotomy. And then now the dead fetus, now that the head is pulled out. But now we have a cadaver because the brain had just been sucked out. And this is what New York just legalized, all right, in anticipation of what could happen. So that they secure abortion up to the ultimate limit, which is before the head of the fetus is out. Actually, the rest of the body is out already, out of the body.
How do they get the fetus to turn? It's so hard to do that.
Yeah. Well, they go in and they breach that fetus one way or another. The fetus is destined to die anyway, so they're going to do it. Yeah, it's barbaric.
I think it's going to cause more complications, more death.
Yes, thanks be to God. Thanks be to God is backfired, because then as soon as New York did it, Virginia wanted to do the same.
I saw that video.
New Mexico, I believe also.
New Mexico, exactly, because you see, that's the thing with Roe v. Wade. Even in the case, in my personal opinion, I think it's very unlikely because it's so entrenched in the American society. But let's say in the ideal case that Roe v. Wade is reversed, what will happen is it will go back to the states, and then each state will decide whether abortion is legal or not. Because as Justice Scalia used to say, very Catholic, very pro-life Justice Scalia said, the Constitution is silent on the unborn. Doesn't say, there's no reference in the US Constitution to the unborn, okay, as a legal person. And therefore, it's silent, and therefore the federal government should have nothing to say about it, and it should revert to each state and let each state decide. And that's also, in my opinion, again, strategically, that's a good thing, because then we can focus on states instead of the whole nation. Right, and then we would have to convince a few million people instead of 300 million people.
Yeah.
And then we can go state by state in making the argument.
what can we do as individuals, as the people that come together
Yeah.
and take it to Congress?
Exactly. There's a lot that we can do. I'll get there toward the end on the health alternatives to abortion. Okay. But yes, I'm going in that direction. So again, just to emphasize, until the head is literally out, the fetal head is out of the mother's body, this fetus, this unborn, is not a legal person in the United States. And that's why abortion is legal. If I have time, I'll also show you a little testimony of Norma McCorvey, who was Roe in Roe versus Wade, her own testimony when she converted. Okay, so let me see. Yeah, totally absurd. Okay, so we have a little time now, so let me do this. Let me go, before we get into alternatives, go here for a moment and pull up Norma's testimony. I have it here, the other lecture, oops. Let me see. Let me do a little hunting here for a moment and the other course. Okay. All right, so the legalization of abortion in the United States happened in 1973 at the level of the Supreme Court. Before then, it was up to each state. And by the way, New York State already in 1970 had the most liberal abortion laws in the nation back then, which it allowed, at least for the first trimester, and then with the medical reason from the second trimester forward. But of course, it did not allow partial birth abortion because it was seen as too extreme back in the 70s. Then Roe v. Wade happened. Roe v. Wade happened. Let me take a break for a moment because I don't want Dr. Claudia to miss this. So give me a moment here. I'm gonna use. Okay, let me give you a little brief background of on Roe v. Wade, because we continually hear about the decision of the Supreme Court in 1973 to legalize abortion in the United States. Okay, so a brief background. Roe and Wade are two fictitious names, like it's done very often in courts. They represent the people or institutions who are against each other. That is why it's a versus. Okay, it was Jane Roe against, I think it was John Wade, both fictitious names. It has now come to known, even by her own revelation and admission in her testimony, that Jane Roe was Norma McCorvey, was her name, her real life name, Norma McCorvey, okay? And Wade, I think it was John Wade, represented the state of Texas. In other words, she lived in Texas, and she was young, she was single, she was pregnant, and she was poor and ignorant, and she was manipulated by a small group of radical feminists to use her as the poster child for getting the legalization of abortion in the US. All right, so the idea is, the way the legal system works is that they took the case. Of course, in Texas, abortion was illegal. In contrast to New York, when in the 70s, abortion was already legal in New York, but it was only in the first trimester, and with the second trimester, they needed a medical indication, and it was to save the life of the mother and so forth, okay? And also in case of rape and incest, which causes a problem because it's still a human being who's also a victim. You know, they have nothing to do with the rape or the abortion, they, the fetus, but they get killed because of rape or incest. Anyway, those were the restrictions in the state of New York, but some abortions were legal in New York before Roe v. Wade. Whereas in Texas, here's a good example where it was illegal, totally illegal, all right? But Norma was in Texas, and so she wanted the abortion. She was convinced by this group of feminists, radical feminists, to take it to court, and of course, it was turned down in Texas, but then they appeal, and they go to a regional court, all right, at the federal level, and that was turned down again, and so they appeal, and they did it on purpose, and they had enough money, because this is a very expensive procedure, of which Norma didn't have the money for, but to take it all the way to the Supreme Court, and that is the prerogative. As long as the next court will hear the case, right, they can keep pushing it and pushing it. That's the appeal process in the United States, all the way to the Supreme Court. Once the Supreme Court makes a decision, that's it, because there's no higher court. In other words, they interpret the Constitution, the US Constitution. Each state in the Union also has a constitution. We have a Florida Constitution, all right, which is different from the US Constitution. The US Constitution covers all of the Americans in the country. But in the state, there are particular restrictions or so forth that are at the level of the state constitution. So we also have a state legislature. We also have a state judiciary. There's a Supreme Court of Florida, right, in Tallahassee. And the equivalent of the executive branch, the president of the United States, at the state of the level is typically the governor. That's the governor. That's the equivalent. At any rate, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in January 22nd, finally the Supreme Court, after going back and forth, it was tied, and the one who broke the tie was Justice Blackmun at that time, Justice Blackmun. And more or less, his reasoning was that when there is a conflict between two entities, right, in this case being Norma, one entity, and her unborn being the other one, when there's a conflict between the two, and it regards life, human life, all right? And we certainly know that Norma is, or Ro, let's say, the Ro is alive because she's a woman. We're looking at her and she is a live human being. So she's protected. She's a legal person as far as the Constitution is concerned. There's no doubt. With regards to the unborn, we don't know if the unborn is human or not, legally, or it's a legal person. We don't know if Ro's conceptus is a legal person or not. Then he used this argument. Because there is no consensus in society, I'm paraphrasing his el fallo, his verdict, but because there is no consensus among the American people on when human life begins, okay? Because there is no consensus on the American population on when human life begins, meaning that we're not sure if her conceptus is a human life or not, okay? Because there's no consensus. But there is certainly consensus that Ro is alive, is human, and it's alive because she's standing in front of us, breathing and talking. Then we have to err on the side on the one who we know for sure is a human, is a live human being, okay? And this one is a legal person. So Ro, in other words, Norma McCorvey, got the full protection of the law, being a legal person, and she had a right then to get rid of this parasite that is in her, because biologically, you can, in an antagonistic model, you can see the unborn as a parasite because the placenta is sucking the nutrients and throwing waste into the circulatory system of the mother. So in an antagonistic way, the human being, the unborn can be seen as a parasite, can be made the argument of a parasite, right? So that's what happens. And therefore, but you see all of the ignorance built in that, and plus the deception, because do you think that we're 300 million people? Maybe back then there were 200 million. Maybe there was 100 million people in the United States. I don't know what the population was in 73, but let's say probably about 150 million or so. Do you think that 150 million people were going to be on consensus on any topic on earth? On any topic? Was the coffee hot enough? Was it tasty enough? I mean, you think of the most banal thing. Is it a beautiful day or is it a horrible day outside? You know, you'll have half of the population saying it's a horrible day, and the other half will say it's a great day, it's a beautiful day. And so can we come together on consensus on just about anything of the 300 million people that we are? Of the banal things, we couldn't agree. Imagine of the fundamental thing like this, okay? where there's a lot of ignorance. It doesn't look like a human. That's why the shapeology as opposed to the morphology. It doesn't, that little zygote is just a piece of tissue that doesn't look like a human being to me because it's got no heads and no arms and legs. So the argument is so absolutely superficial. And yet that superficial argument stuck to the point that Roe could have her abortion legally for the first time. So this was first legalized abortion and so that's another thing that happens. A state law cannot be more restrictive than a federal law, or more liberal than a federal law. In other words, if the federal law allows it, then the state has to allow it. You can put some restrictions on it, but you have to maintain abortion as legal. Now you can put some medical restrictions, but the abortion itself has to be legal, all right? So you put roadblocks if you will. So,
No, her child is living.
exactly, that's the whole point. So this is what happens. So Norma ended up not having the abortion, first of all. She ended up keeping her child and 2 more, so she had 3 children, okay? But originally she did stay pro-choice, pro-abortion, and she would go on rallies and rally women. This is women's liberation. This is finally what we needed to get rid of the oppression of men, and now we can have sex and have an abortion, and we don't have to worry about it. And she became very, very pro-choice. She, again, manipulated by this group of radicals. And she would go into abortion clinics and counsel the women and the pregnant moms who were crying they want to have the abortion. She would convince them to have the abortion and all that. She was very, very pro-choice, all right? Until finally, one day, this is what happened. This is her own testimony, okay? This is Norma. I was sitting in an OR, operation room office, when I noticed a fetal development poster. All of a sudden, after years, there's a fetal development poster. That's what I've been showing you for the past 3 weeks. All right. The progression was so obvious. The eyes were so sweet. It turned my heart just looking at them. I ran outside, and finally, it dawned on me. Norma, I said to myself, they're right. They who? The pro-lifers. You know, the ones who are demonstrating outside, don't kill your child, pray the rosary, whatever. Okay, they're right. The pro-lifers. I had worked with pregnant women for years. I had been through 3 pregnancies and deliveries myself. So as a mom, she knew what she had inside, right? I should have known. Yet something in that poster made me lose my breath. I kept seeing the picture of that tiny 10-week-old embryo. So we're talking about 1 inch long, right? At 8 weeks, they have all the organs in place, but they're tiny. So really, this is a fetus, technically. And I said to myself, that's a baby. And as if blinders just fell off my eyes, and I suddenly understood the truth, that's a baby. Like you say, Drizel, it's a baby. Okay? Therefore, he's a baby, she's a baby. And so what happens to her? She feels crushed under the truth of this realization. I had to face up the awful reality. Abortion wasn't about products of conception or missed periods, okay, just tissue. It was about children being killed in their mother's wombs. All those years, I was wrong. Signing that affidavit in the court, okay, when she asked for the legalization of abortion, I was wrong. Working in an abortion clinic, I was wrong. No more of this first trimester, second trimester, third trimester stuff, right, when they're trying to tone down the humanity of the embryo. Abortion at any point was wrong. It was so clear, painfully clear. So Norma, Roe, converts to pro-life, and she spends the rest of her lifetime, she died a few years ago, going to pro-life rallies, trying to convince pro-abortions, you know, I was wrong, I made a mistake. The daughter? Yes. Now she's still alive. Yes.
Also pro-life.
Mm-hmm.
That has continued the
The moms.
trying to undo what she did.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Imagine the conscience, I mean, I get goosebumps, you know, the conscience of this woman.
It's like the abortionist doctor who has a conversion.
Yes, yes. Bernard Nathan is another one. That's another you can look up.
Shows,
Bernard
like, how
Nathan.
ignorant she was in the beginning. And I mean, even Planned Parenthood, the person who started it was a white woman who wanted to kill, like, didn't want the black babies, the Hispanic babies.
Oh, yes.
They targeted ignorant people that didn't have an education and really believed that there was no baby. So they could hold it.
Yes, yes. I don't want to take too much time, but I do want to put those two names down because you can look them up. These are people who have shaped the history, the modern history of the United States, last century, you know, the 20th century, by Bernard Nathan, or Nathan's son. I think it's Nathan. Give me a minute, because Bernard Nathan was a doctor who had an abortion practice, had dozens, if not hundreds, of abortion clinics throughout the whole United States. He would fly back and forth. He had a huge crew of a team of abortionists. And yeah, Nathan's son. There he is. Yeah, I saw him once in the talk. Bernard Nathan's son, you can look him up. He said in his testimony at some point, when I got him personally, aside from all the other team of doctors that he had doing abortions throughout the US, when he got to the 2000th abortion, he stopped counting. Okay, himself had done over 2,000 because he stopped counting. He converted to pro-life and spent the rest of his life talking about the evil of abortion. All right. Sadly, the other one is, what is the name of the nurse? Give it to me. The one who founded Planned Parenthood. Yeah, no, but no, the one who founded Planned Parenthood in the 40s, yeah. 40s and the 50s, who got the pill doing. Oh, I should talk about her in contraception.
Margaret Sanger.
Margaret Sanger. Sorry. Yeah, Margaret Sanger. We'll talk about Margaret Sanger. She didn't convert initially, and she started Catholic. And then when pro-choice and pro-abortion. But so Norma converts to pro-life, and then Norma converts to Catholicism. Norma McCorvey. I think. All right, and Bernard Nathan's son also converted to pro-life, and eventually he also converted to Catholicism. So we have two great conversions. But in spite of this, we see that it has become totally politicized. And so here we are today, and it has not only become politicized, but it has become partisan. The sad reality is that we are in a bipartisan system. Okay, political system, we are in a bipartisan system. What do I mean by bipartisan system? Exactly, just two parties, even though in the books, on the books, there are partisan system. In the books, there are other parties. There's an independent party. There's a populist party. There's several parties, but they don't have enough voting to get any traction. So realistically, it's either the Democrats or the Republicans, and so they're kind of locked in to the issues. If one party says yay on the issue, then the other party has to say nay on the same issue, and they have to split it that way. So if one party is pro-life, then the other party has to be pro-choice.
Wasn't the Democratic Party at some point pro-life, and then it kind of got switched around?
I don't know really, but I think that if we go back,
Clinton was pro-life, and then
well, so Clinton used to say, he had a phrase that abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. Now the rare has gone out the window. Okay, and they just say safe and legal anytime, all the time, whenever a woman wants it. But at least Bill supposedly held that that he had that line, that abortion is safe, legal, and rare. So like a last extreme thing. It's no longer a last extreme, it's become mainstream, and in the minds of many people, it has become a type of contraception. Because in fact, a number of women have repeated abortions, and they'll have 6, 8, or 10 abortions, okay, at different stages, and then that's the reality. So that's what we have, because it has become a pseudo-contraceptive mentality. Now, having said all this, how can we focus on some positive? Let's see, yeah. Right? How can we focus on some of the positive? Of course, the two alternatives are either to keep the baby or to give the baby for adoption. It's very challenging because we also know that psychologically the mother bonds with the child once she gets the quickening, la patadita, and she feels that there's a live person there, they start bonding. And so really to take the pregnancy to term and then to give him for adoption is challenging. All right, so they end up, most of the time they end up keeping the baby. Also because, I'm sorry. So also because in the United States, both at the federal, the state, and the county level, there are so many advantages for moms, for pregnant moms, and help for poor mothers and so forth, that they get all the support that they need. They get the financial support, they get the medical support, they can get the spiritual and psychological support if they want it from a number of organizations. And so it's not that hard to keep a baby today, even for an unwed mother, right? We know it can be done, and with a little bit of effort and goodwill. There's a whole support team, huge, both public and private, that can help that pregnant mom carry her pregnancy to term and then care for the child moving forward. I can't tell you how many couples have counsel and even single moms to keep their baby. They get the medical support from Family and Children's, right? And if they have some other children, a lady, she was pregnant with one child and she had 2 other kids already born. And the medical support that she got, the medical free medical for her and the unborn, and for the other 2 kids who were also born for free. So they were all included in, all right? And then there's WIC, W-I-C, for women and infant and children, for food, clothing, the diapers, everything. There's pro-life clinics also, there's Heartbeat, and there's also, the Respect Life Centers of the Archdiocese, which there are 6. There's one just a few blocks away from here, the Palmetto, just on the other side of the Palmetto, and so forth, where they do including sonograms and everything else. So bottom line, there's a lot of support that can be given. The whole thing is trying to convince the mom to not have the abortion, okay? So that's the challenge. That's where we get the challenge. But it's not just the mom also. And here I want to switch over, and I'll bring you this little context because I have it in the other presentation. Let's see. Yes, so this is a list of resources. For example, Heartbeat of Miami is evangelical, but typically the Heartbeat clinics that I know of, there are about 3 in the city of Miami, in the county, and they have sonograms. So when the mom starts hearing the heartbeat, that's a good time of identification. I think it's about 150 heartbeats per minute, so it's at least twice, if not 3 times the rate of the born human. Boom, 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 it's very fast because it's a lot of stuff going on, right? A lot of circulation and growth, 5,000 times the original size and all that. The Respect Life, also, we have 6 clinics, I think 4 in Broward and 2 in Dade. Then DCF, this is at the state level. I have a cousin who works, she's been working here for years, for decades. So these are all contact numbers. What I did for the other course, I teach this at the undergraduate level, and I made a printout of this and gave it to the kids, to the students, in case they want to use it. Or it says, if you know of someone who is pregnant, maybe you want to give them this, right? WIC, I mentioned, this is at the federal level. Then, Project Joseph. So these are things that we can do. We can become involved in these groups and give some support and assistance. Project Joseph is about the fathers, the boyfriends or the husbands who are taking their girls to the clinic, right? Sometimes against the woman's will. I've seen this. The guy is dragging her, literally got her by the arm, and we want to talk to them on the sidewalk in front of the clinic, and the woman wants to come and talk, but he won't let me, I have to go now, and he's dragging her into the clinic. Sometimes I see moms taking their daughters into the clinic, and when they pull into the parking lot, they have the rosary hanging from the mirror. It's crazy. It's schizophrenic, you know. Hialeah has the reputation of having one of the highest densities of abortion clinics in the US, okay? And it's such a pro-family. Any Sunday you drive around Hialeah and you see family gatherings, puerco asado, and big family reunions. It's a very family-oriented town, but it's a double standard because a lot of abortion clinics in there. So these are the challenges. Project Joseph is to work with the guys. This was started actually by a brother who he's a retired psychiatrist. Ray, Father Jay. Father Jay, he's originally from Puerto Rico. He grew up here in the States also. He is a husband, a father, a widower. He widowed, and he's got several children. And eventually he founded a religious order of Franciscans here they're in Broward, okay, in Broward County, Franciscans for Life. And they're all religious brothers who are pro-life. And he invented this Project Joseph. In other words, one day he was hanging out at the sidewalk of an abortion clinic, trying to convince some pregnant moms not to have an abortion. And he noticed that the guys, the husbands or the boyfriends, were hanging around waiting for the abortion to complete and then leave because the woman can't drive after she has the procedure, several hours. And they're just hanging out in the parking lot, smoking and talking to each other, the guys. So he started approaching the guys and said, hey guys, how about we talk about this? Somehow, you know, he did the possible and started to talk about these guys. And some of them actually showed an interest because they were ignorant and they were afraid and it was not in their plan to have a child at that point. And says, well, it's not such a bad thing. Look, I'm a husband, I'm a father, and I raised all my kids and all this, and there was a lot of hardship, but now my kids are my joy. And so he started convincing some of the guys, right, to become pro-life and to actually take their women out of the clinic and into a pro-life clinic and give life to that child. And so he started Project Joseph, precisely based on St. Joseph, who had a very difficult pregnancy to deal with, okay? And his wife was a pregnant mom who was unwed. Well, she was betrothed at that time, but anyway, you know the background. So he started Project Joseph, which is for the guys, okay? And they do that, and they come to the abortion clinics, they come to the pro-life clinics, the husbands or the boyfriends who opted for life, and they sit in class and they get instruction on how to be a man and how to go out and get a job and how to maintain their kids and so forth. And then they get points for that. And with those points, they can go to the dispensary and pull out from the dispensary clothing and food and diapers and everything that they need for their kids, right? And so that's how it's worked out on a point system. And in the meantime, they get instruction and they get jobs and all that. And so that's Project Joseph. Started here in Miami, in the Archdiocese, and was through Joan Crown, and the Archbishop approved it. And I think now it's become a model for the US, and other dioceses are adopting this Project Joseph. So very happy that it started Brother Jay. Okay, Project Rachel is, so the woman did go ahead with the abortion. we don't abandon her. There's hope. I mean, John Paul II talks about that in Evangelium Vitae, right, in the Gospel of Life. We need to help that woman be reconciled with herself, with God, and with her unborn children whom she aborted, and receive forgiveness. If there is repentance, there is forgiveness. And so Project Rachel is walking with that woman who had the abortion to try to get her to realize what she did and to ask forgiveness and to receive forgiveness, and especially to forgive herself for what she did, because the evil one gets in there and says, what you did is unforgivable. And that's, of course, we know that's the evil one, okay? So Project Rachel is for the women who have had the abortion, and it's a counseling thing. If you want to get into this, that's another way you can be trained for Project Rachel, and when she is ready, then maybe days, weeks, or months later, she will finally go see a priest for a confession, okay? So all these resources are available. I'll print them out also and give you a little sheet in case you know people. And I always have my cell phone also available for whoever wants to call me, because at this point, I've been here for about almost 50 years already. So these are alternatives, right? These are healthy alternatives. But we have to support the mom, the pregnant mom, every way we can without condoning the intercourse that was not done for the proper reason and all that. It's there. Now, there were these, but it's already beyond 12:45, so I'm going to stop. I'll just pick up here. Some things I want to cover with you, ectopic pregnancy, for example, the bioethics of an ectopic pregnancy, okay? But to do that, we first need to get into the principle of double effects, which there's no time to cover now, but I'll cover it at the beginning of next lecture. All right? So a lot to say on this topic. It's become highly ideological, highly politicized. I find that most of the time, in my 30, 40 years of being involved in pro-life, I've yet to be able to get a rational argument, a rational dialogue with a pro-choice or a pro-abortionist. Rational argument, no. It's always yelling and screaming, get out of my face, you're a misogynist, you can never get pregnant, you know nothing about this, you know, and that's what, that's in the best case scenario. The worst case scenario starts. So, priest, how many kids have you abused today?
Oh my gosh.
That's what they tell me at the board. They yell. So, priest, how many kids have you abused today? That's how they, it's laughable at this point, but that's how they started the dialogue.
Yeah, they tell me awful things. I say, oh, do you want to priest some people?
Yeah, exactly.
Like for the end of life, I'll say, you want me to priest? Are you crazy? So they could rape my children. I have children in
Exactly. That's how they start. So very, very challenging. They go right to the emotional stuff. And this is training. This is training that Planned Parenthood produces. You know, to make it totally antagonistic, to not engage, because you engage, you may convert, like Norma McCorvey. Okay, so keep it antagonistic. All right, you've endured today a lot. Thank you. I'm going to stop here, unless you have some questions or comments.
I really want to read a quote that I found. I'm going to send you guys an article that, about Margaret Sanger.
Oh.
So on a radio show, she reported to say that morons, mental defectives, epileptics, illiterates, paupers, unemployables, criminals, prostitutes, and dope fiends ought to be surgically sterilized. If they wish, she said, such people should also be able to choose a lifelong segregated existence in labor camps. That's how she felt about people. That's how she was helping.
Yes. This is Margaret Sanger in the 30s and the 40s. We'll get to her when we look at contraception, which I think is coming up, and the background to that, because she was Catholic. She was the daughter of an Irish Catholic marriage, many kids in her family and so forth. So we'll look at that also logical. But she was a eugenicist. She was involved in the eugenics movement in the United States, which was an offshoot spillover from Nazi Germany into the United States, an active eugenics movement in the 30s and 40s. Yeah.
Have you watched the movie October Baby?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, I've heard, I've never seen it, but I've heard of it. Maybe I should take a look. Yes, October Baby, huh?
October Baby.
October Baby. Yeah, I'll take a look. I think it's available now on YouTube. Yeah. Okay, very good. Thank you, and we'll see each other next Saturday. Hopefully, the gates will be back to normal by then.
It was a
All
good
right.
class, Bobby.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay,
It's hard to
now.
keep a topic like this, like everybody on focus, because it's like a heated
Yes, it is.
topic, particularly nowadays.
Yeah,
Oh,
so from now on, they're all going to be bioethical issues, okay? And then wait until we get into the end of life. It's more the same. So stay tuned. Okay, thanks again. Bye-bye.